In a world growing more fragmented each day, where meaning slips through the cracks of ordinary life, the thought of Carl Gustav Jung rises like a call for wholeness. More than a psychiatrist or psychologist, Jung was a cartographer of the human soul, an explorer of the dark depths of the unconscious and the bright heights of the spirit. His work goes far beyond clinics and universities. It echoes through ancient myths, modern dreams, existential anxieties, and the timeless symbols that shape every human life. Jung invites us to look inward, to move beyond the masks of the persona and the darkness of the shadow, to converse with forgotten symbols, and to realize that the unconscious is not chaos to be controlled, but a deeper order to be understood. His philosophy is both a psychology of the soul and a metaphysics of meaning, a bridge between science and spirituality, reason and mystery, the individual and the collective. Through ideas such as archetypes, the collective unconscious, and individuation, Jung traces a path of return to oneself, a journey of transformation in which the psyche seeks integration and the human being rediscovers the sacred within. To study Jung, then, is more than understanding a theory. It's taking part in a philosophical journey toward the center of one's own being, toward the self. On July 26, 1875, in Keswil, a small village on the shores of Lake Constance, Switzerland, a boy named Carl Gustav Jung was born. At first glance, nothing suggested that this son of a Protestant pastor would become one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. Yet Jung's destiny seemed, from the very beginning, to be intertwined with the deepest questions of the human soul. Jung grew up in an environment where faith and mystery coexisted. His father, a reserved pastor, struggled with his own spirituality, while his mother told stories filled with the mystical and the unexplained. As a child, Jung experienced vivid visions and symbolic dreams that would shape his entire life. To him, these weren't just products of imagination. Even as a boy, he believed there was something beyond the surface of consciousness, something ancient, vast, and full of meaning. During his teenage years, Jung felt deeply isolated. He later described that time as a kind of inner split. On one side, the ordinary student who went to school and talked to friends. On the other, an inner figure, solemn and almost ancient, who observed the world from a distance. He already sensed that his mind held many layers and dimensions. This inner division, which could have led others to paralysis, became the foundation of his lifelong study of the human psyche. And that's perhaps what set him apart. Jung didn't run from his inner chaos. He explored it. He enrolled at the University of Basel to study medicine, but it was during his psychiatry training at Burghölzli Hospital in Zurich that his path began to align with the deeper currents of the human mind. Under the guidance of psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler, Jung studied patients with schizophrenia and hysteria, disorders that were, at the time, misunderstood and heavily stigmatized. Jung, however, saw human meaning where others saw madness. There, he began developing his word association method, which led to the discovery of psychic complexes, emotional centers within the unconscious that shaped behavior and language. This was a breakthrough. Jung realized that the human mind wasn't a straight line of logic, but a symbolic, mysterious universe. Consciousness, he said, was only a small island surrounded by a vast ocean of the unconscious. His search to understand that ocean led him to Sigmund Freud in 1907. Their meeting was intense. Jung was 32, Freud was 50. They quickly became close friends. Freud called Jung his most brilliant disciple, the heir to psychoanalysis. They spent hours discussing dreams, myths, neuroses, and traumas, as if exploring a new continent of the mind together. But as happens with many great minds, their friendship was destined to end. Freud believed that repressed sexual desire was the main force behind the unconscious. Every neurosis, he claimed, could be traced back to unresolved libido. Jung disagreed. He felt that something deeper and more symbolic was at play, a spiritual dimension of the psyche that couldn't be reduced to biology or sexuality. This difference became irreconcilable. For Jung, the unconscious wasn't just a vault of forbidden desires. It was also a source of wisdom, filled with universal images and symbols that connected all humanity. By 1913, the friendship broke apart completely. Jung left Freud's psychoanalysis and began creating his own system, analytical psychology. That separation was painful. Jung fell into a period of isolation and inner turmoil. He admitted that for years he lived between collapse and revelation, haunted by visions, dreams, and powerful inner experiences. But instead of suppressing them, he wrote them down in detailed journals. This process eventually became the foundation for his mysterious and beautiful work, the Red Book, which remained unpublished for decades. During this time, Jung wasn't just surviving his inner storms. He was mapping them, inspired by mythology, alchemy, ancient religions, and Eastern philosophies. He began building a new vision of the psyche. To him, the human being wasn't a bundle of traumas, but a traveler seeking wholeness. Yet Jung was never a blind mystic. He remained a doctor, a scientist, a disciplined thinker. His life walked a fine line between reason and mystery. Unlike Freud, who saw religion as a childish illusion, Jung believed that the religious instinct was part of the human psyche itself, not a matter of belief, but a fundamental psychological reality. The sacred, he said, lived inside the collective unconscious, as symbol, force, and necessity. Jung devoted himself to studying symbols and archetypes that appeared across cultures and ages. He noticed that civilizations separated by centuries often produced myths with the same structures, evidence, he thought, of a shared psychic foundation among all humans. He called this the collective unconscious. His ideas influenced not only psychology, but also art, literature, philosophy, spirituality, and even artificial intelligence. Jung became a bridge between worlds, between science and religion, logic and imagination, East and West. But before he could build that bridge, he had to cross his own deserts. The break with Freud was not just intellectual, it was existential. Like Socrates, who refused to abandon the pursuit of truth, Jung stayed loyal to his vision, even when it meant professional isolation and the risk of being branded a heretic of psychology. Jung lived through difficult times. Europe was torn by wars, cultural crises, and identity conflict. The 20th century was being born in pain, and many sought salvation in ideologies, materialism, or nihilism. Jung, instead, looked inward. He believed humanity's transformation could only begin with the transformation of the individual. As a true philosopher of the soul, he dedicated his life to exploring what most people avoid: the unconscious, fear, symbols, dreams, inner demons, and also the hidden light that lives in every human being. For many, philosophy belongs to reason, psychology to the mind, and religion to the spirit. But for Carl Gustav Jung, these separations made no sense. His intellectual life was a nearly sacred search for unity between science, philosophy, and spirituality. This journey often put him at odds with scientific orthodoxy, but it also made him one of the most daring and original thinkers of the modern era. Jung believed that humans are not just flesh and logic. We are also myth, mystery, symbol, and soul. That belief led him to rediscover what modern science had dismissed: the symbolic wisdom of the ancients. While academic psychology relied on data and experiments, Jung looked to alchemy, Gnostic gospels, myths, and Eastern scriptures as mirrors of the human psyche. To some, this sounded like mysticism. For Jung, it was still science, but a science humble enough to admit its limits. He knew rational thought couldn't grasp all of reality. As Socrates once said, "Know thyself." Jung made that his life's mission, but he also knew that the self couldn't be found through logic alone, only through symbolic imagination, inner experience, and spiritual humility. That's where philosophy entered his work, not as abstract theory, but as a way of life. His philosophical influences were deep and personal. He drew from Heraclitus, who said the soul is a living fire in constant flux. From Plato, whose ideas inspired Jung's notion of archetypes as psychic blueprints, and from the Gnostics, who saw divine knowledge as something found within, not outside. Gnosticism, in particular, shaped Jung's analytical psychology. It taught that salvation comes from inner knowledge, from self-awareness, as divine revelation. Jung saw this as the essence of individuation, the inner journey toward the self, where one sheds social masks and moves toward wholeness. He wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." That line sums up his philosophy. We are not only shaped by the outer world, we carry an entire universe within us. Jung also studied alchemy in depth, and what seemed eccentric at first turned into one of his greatest insights. He realized that alchemists, in trying to turn lead into gold, were describing inner transformation. The base material symbolized the unconscious, the fire of the furnace, life's experiences, and the gold, the self, the complete and integrated personality achieved through deep self-knowledge. This wasn't romantic mysticism. It was a philosophical reading of transformation, giving meaning to suffering and chaos as necessary stages of becoming. Here Jung echoes Nietzsche, who saw pain as the path to inner strength. Nietzsche said, "One must have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." Jung translated that idea into psychological terms. Another major influence came from the East. Jung was one of the first Western thinkers to take texts like the I Ching, Tao Te Ching, and Upanishads seriously. Instead of dismissing them as superstition, he studied them deeply, recognizing in them models of psychic balance and symbolic wisdom. From Taoism, Jung learned the principle of complementary opposites, yin and yang, and the idea that harmony comes from integrating them. He applied this to the psyche. Mental health, he said, depends on integrating inner opposites, light and shadow, reason and intuition, masculine and feminine. From the Upanishads, he absorbed the teaching that Atman, the inner self, is identical to Brahman, the universal reality, an idea that resonated with his view of the self as both the center and totality of the human psyche, a mirror of the divine within. Importantly, Jung never asked anyone to adopt a tradition blindly. He said that a symbol only has value if it's alive within one's own experience. His philosophy was experiential, introspective, and existential, not dogmatic. He didn't want to create a new religion, but to restore the symbolic dimension that gives life meaning. In this way, his philosophy resembles Kierkegaard's, the father of Christian existentialism, who taught that truth is not abstract, but deeply personal. Like Kierkegaard, Jung believed that authenticity comes from confronting doubt and paradox, and choosing to keep walking anyway. For Jung, that walk always led inward. He warned that modern life's greatest illness is inner emptiness, the loss of meaning and disconnection from the symbols that shape the soul. He argued that philosophy should not be sterile rationalism, but, as in ancient times, a guide for life, a path for the soul. He also became a sharp critic of modernity. Jung saw the modern world as obsessed with materialism, technical rationality, and the denial of the sacred. He wrote, "Science has given us many wonderful things, but it has taken away our soul." His philosophy was, in that sense, an act of resistance, a defense of the sacredness of existence. Without myths, symbols, and spirituality, he said, people become fragmented, cynical, and lost, projecting their shadows onto others, ideologies, or politics. That's why Jung didn't limit his philosophy to Western traditions. He drew from indigenous wisdom, shamanism, mysticism, and prophetic dreams, anything that revealed the archetypal structures of the psyche. And that's why Jung remains so relevant today. In an age obsessed with quick answers and instant solutions, he invites us to ask the oldest human questions. Who am I? Why do I suffer? What gives my life meaning? These are philosophical questions, and Jung didn't give ready-made answers. He offered a symbolic map, an invitation to the journey of individuation. Jung showed that true philosophy isn't just in books, it's in how we face life's abysses. He revived the ancient role of the philosopher, not as a distant theorist, but as a guide for the soul. He wrote, "Become who you are." That phrase, echoing the call of Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Nietzsche, sums up his message. There is no external path that replaces the journey within, and in our time, there may be no philosophy more necessary than the one that reconnects us to our lost wholeness. The history of human thought is full of powerful encounters and inevitable separations. One of the most symbolic of these was the break between Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung. Two giants of modern psychology, united by their courage to explore the depths of the mind, but divided by one essential question: what is the human soul, and what truly lives in the unconscious? When Jung met Freud in 1907, the admiration was mutual. Freud was 50, Jung was 32. During their very first meeting, they talked for over 13 hours straight. It was as if both had finally found someone they could speak openly with about the most forbidden topics of the psyche: dreams, trauma, desire, and neuroses, subjects most doctors at the time avoided. Freud, already established as the father of psychoanalysis, saw in Jung a brilliant and promising heir to his legacy, a young, charismatic Swiss psychiatrist, far from Vienna's anti-Semitic atmosphere, and able to communicate with the scientific world effectively. Freud believed Jung could bring psychoanalysis the legitimacy it still lacked. But tension existed between them from the very start. Jung was far more philosophical, spiritual, and symbolic than Freud. While Freud relied heavily on a medical and physiological model of the mind, Jung felt that this model reduced human beings to something smaller than they really were. For Jung, man was not only a biological being driven by repressed sexual instincts, he was also the bearer of an ancient soul filled with symbolic images, myths, and experiences of transcendence. Freud saw the unconscious as the basement of the mind, a storage room for repressed memories, traumas, and desires, especially sexual ones. He believed libido, sexual energy, was the main engine of the psyche, and that repressing it caused most psychological problems. Jung found that vision far too narrow. He didn't deny the importance of sexuality, but he believed the unconscious wasn't just a dump for repressed impulses. It was a creative spiritual field full of symbols, dreams, and intuitions that transcended the individual. As Jung put it, Freud's unconscious is a kind of personal garbage heap. Mine is the matrix of symbolic life. That single statement showed just how deep the rift between them had grown. For Jung, the human psyche held the potential for spiritual evolution. He didn't just want to treat symptoms. He wanted to understand the inner paths that lead a person toward wholeness. This pushed him to study not only patients, but also myths, ancient religions, Gnostic texts, alchemy, and astrology. Freud dismissed all of that as superstition. Jung saw it as the living language of the soul. Their disagreement wasn't just theoretical, it was philosophical. Freud wanted to explain human behavior through instinct and social repression. Jung wanted to understand human beings as living totalities, made up of opposing forces, light and shadow, reason and intuition, matter and spirit, that needed to be integrated over a lifetime. Freud interpreted dreams as disguised expressions of repressed desire, mostly sexual. Jung saw dreams very differently, as symbolic messages from the unconscious, attempts by the psyche to balance and guide the conscious mind on its inner journey. One story shows this divide perfectly. Jung once told Freud about a dream where he explored a house. The upper floor was refined and modern, the ground floor older, the basement primitive, and below it traces of prehistory. Jung saw this as a profound symbol of the layers of the psyche. Freud, however, brushed it off coldly. That's about a repressed wish. Jung was devastated. To him, Freud was blind to the dream's deeper archetypal meaning. Over time, Jung felt trapped in Freud's system. What began as a revolutionary movement had turned, in his eyes, into a rigid dogma, with Freud as its near prophet. Jung longed for freedom to explore what Freud rejected: the mystical, the symbolic, the sacred. So he began to distance himself. The final break came in 1913, after years of growing tension. It was a painful divorce, both personal and intellectual. Jung fell into a deep inner crisis. He described those years as a confrontation with the unconscious, a time of visions, solitude, and intense self-exploration that he carefully recorded in journals, the beginnings of what would later become the Red Book. And it was during this dark period that the real Jung was born. Free from Freud's shadow, he developed analytical psychology, a system that didn't just focus on the past and repression, but also on the future and potential. The unconscious, he argued, wasn't only pathological, it was also creative. Here, the split with Freud became something even greater. Freud saw man as trapped in conflict between instincts and society's demands. Jung saw man as a pilgrim, a seeker of the self, the totality of the psyche. This idea echoed ancient philosophy. Just as Plato said the soul longs to return to the world of ideas, Jung believed the psyche yearns to return to its archetypal unity, lost through ego conflicts. Jung's goal wasn't just to heal mental illness. It was to heal the split between modern man and his soul. That split, he believed, was the true disease of the age, born from rational arrogance and the rejection of myth, art, and religion, the very things that give life meaning. Freud saw religion as a childish illusion and myth as a collective neurosis. Jung saw them as symbolic languages of the unconscious, authentic ways for the soul to express itself. So when Jung broke with Freud, he wasn't just leaving a mentor. He was rejecting a mechanistic worldview that tried to fit the human soul into formulas and choosing a more dangerous path, one of symbols, doubt, multiplicity, and depth. That choice came at a price. Jung was mocked, criticized, and accused of mysticism for years. But he never wavered. He knew he was opening a bridge between science and spirituality, psychology and philosophy, reason and mystery. Looking back now, we can see that this rupture wasn't a failure. It was a birth. Freud and Jung followed separate roads, each leaving a vast legacy. But Jung dared to go further. Where Freud saw desire, Jung saw meaning. Where Freud saw repression, Jung saw a calling. Where Freud saw illness, Jung saw initiation. Their break wasn't just theoretical, it was existential. Jung chose to listen to the unconscious not as pathology, but as a messenger. And in doing so, he gave psychology something it had lost: a soul. The separation between Jung and Freud marked a turning point in modern psychology. From that moment on, the field split into two visions of humanity. Freud remained committed to the idea that the unconscious was a vault of repressed desires, mainly sexual. Jung proposed something far broader and more timeless, that the unconscious is a living field of archetypal images, a collective heritage, a mythology alive within each of us. Out of that insight came analytical psychology, Jung's life's work. And its foundation was philosophical. The human psyche cannot be reduced to instinct or explained by rational, mechanical laws. It is symbolic, dynamic, and transcendent, a meeting point between the human and the sacred. For Freud, to heal was to free the patient from repression. For Jung, to heal was to help the person discover their own myth. In Jung's view, the unconscious wasn't a dark storage room, but a living landscape of dreams, symbols, and possibilities. It held not only personal history, but the shared structures of humanity, what he called the collective unconscious. This marked a complete shift in worldview. Freud's model was scientific and mechanical, influenced by 19th century positivism and Newtonian physics, a world where everything had a clear cause and effect. Jung's approach was symbolic and holistic, closer to the spirit of Heraclitus, Plato, and Eastern philosophy. He believed that the soul can't be explained through linear causality alone, that we must also consider meaning, purpose, and synchronicity, events connected by significance rather than cause. It's a worldview much like the Tao Te Ching, where reality is not fragmented but woven together by invisible symbolic threads. In this new psychology, the unconscious became a guide, not an enemy. It presents the images and symbols that challenge and orient consciousness, pushing us to grow. Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not only the repository of what has been repressed, but the nursery of all that is yet to come." But that sentence captures the essence of Jung's philosophy. The unconscious is not a problem to be solved, but a voice to be heard, containing not only our past, but also our potential. Analytical psychology therefore became deeply existential. Its goal wasn't merely to relieve symptoms, but to integrate the total self. That required courage, the willingness to face one's own depths and interpret the symbols that rise from within. In that sense, Jung's thought echoes Socrates. Like him, Jung believed wisdom begins with self-knowledge. But while Socrates used dialogue with others, Jung introduced dialogue with the unconscious, listening to what the soul itself wants to say. He called this process active imagination, consciously engaging with inner images and voices, letting the unconscious reveal its wisdom symbolically. It was, in a sense, a conversation with one's own soul. Jung's ideas drew heavily from ancient traditions, Gnostic texts, where self-knowledge leads to redemption, alchemy, where transforming matter mirrors the transformation of the spirit, and Eastern philosophies like Hinduism and Buddhism, which see awakening as recognizing the unity within. Above all, Jung stayed loyal to myth. He saw humanity's great stories, the hero, the mother, the sage, the shadow, not as fictions, but as living patterns of the soul that repeat within us all. His psychology wasn't a clinical method, it was a symbolic philosophy of existence. Every person, he said, lives out their own myth. Discovering that myth is the heart of individuation, the journey toward inner wholeness and union with the self. That journey is often painful and lonely. Jung compared it to the hero's path, leaving the familiar world, facing inner monsters, descending into darkness, and returning transformed. But unlike ancient epics, this adventure happens entirely within. Jung's philosophy of the psyche taught that mental health is not the absence of conflict, but the integration of opposites, reason and emotion, ego and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow. Integration is not a final destination, but a living process, a constant dance of balance. His view resonated with Hegel's dialectic, where being develops through tension, and with the I Ching's wisdom, where change and balance are eternal. By turning the unconscious into a symbolic landscape, Jung also redefined the role of the therapist, no longer a doctor curing a passive patient, but a companion and interpreter of symbols, guiding the meeting between ego and self. Thus, psychology returned to its original meaning, from the Greek psyche, soul, and logos, study. Jung restored psychology as the study of the soul, not through formulas, but through contact with mystery. His philosophy of the psyche is ultimately a philosophy of inner transformation. It calls us to stop projecting our problems onto the world and instead take responsibility for our inner lives, not as guilt, but as inner authority. As Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." Those words are more than poetic. They're a philosophical invitation. Jung reminds us that to change the world, we must first look within. The break with Freud, then, wasn't just a theoretical split. It was the birth of a new understanding of the human being. A psychology that respects science but goes beyond it. One that sees the unconscious not as an enemy, but as a silent ally. A wise inner guide waiting to be heard. Jung opened the door to a new realm, a psychology with a soul. And that, perhaps, is his greatest philosophical legacy. Throughout history, human beings have tried to understand what lies behind consciousness. We know what we think, feel, and want, but there's a deeper, quieter, hidden layer beneath all of that, what Freud called the unconscious. Carl Gustav Jung, however, went further. He not only recognized the existence of a personal unconscious, made up of forgotten memories, traumas, and repressed experiences, but proposed something infinitely deeper, the collective unconscious. It was one of the most revolutionary and daring ideas in modern psychology. For Jung, the unconscious isn't just shaped by individual experience. Deep within each of us lies an inherited, ancestral layer of the psyche, a shared mental foundation common to all humanity. This level of the mind is made up of universal structures, emotional patterns, primordial images, and symbolic forms that appear across cultures and throughout history. He wrote, "The collective unconscious is identical in all people and forms a universal, superpersonal, inherited basis of the psyche." But what does that really mean? Imagine that beneath the surface of the conscious mind, there's an invisible network connecting all of us, a kind of psychic memory of humanity that lives inside every individual. This network doesn't contain specific memories, like childhood scenes or personal traumas, but forms and symbols that quietly shape the way we experience life. These are a priori structures, existing before personal experience, that guide how we feel, think, and even dream. Jung developed this idea through clinical observation. He noticed that many of his patients dreamed of strange figures, ancient symbols, or mythological scenes they had never encountered in real life. Winged serpents, gods, labyrinths, mandalas. How could someone with no exposure to those images produce them spontaneously? Jung's answer: they came from the collective unconscious. At first, this concept might sound mystical, but it has deep philosophical roots. Plato, for example, taught that we don't really learn ideas. We remember them because they already exist within our soul. For Plato, knowledge is recollection. For Jung, the archetypes of the collective unconscious work in a similar way. They are psychic structures that prefigure experience, symbolic molds that organize how we perceive reality. Just as our bodies carry the genetic traces of biological evolution, Jung believed our minds carry psychic traces of humanity's history, an inherited symbolic DNA containing the fears, hopes, conflicts, and images that have shaped the human soul for thousands of years. These universal structures within the collective unconscious are called archetypes, and we'll explore them in depth later. But the key point is that the collective unconscious isn't individual. It's transpersonal. It exists in you, in me, in everyone. It's what allows a Greek myth to resonate with someone living in the 21st century. It's why similar symbols appear in completely different cultures around the world. Here lies one of the most beautiful aspects of Jung's theory. The human being is not an island. Our psyche isn't just the sum of our private experiences or personal traumas. We are part of a story much older and larger than ourselves. Our dreams, our fears, our desires, all of them carry an ancestral echo. There's a living memory of humanity inside us. This idea is deeply humanizing. It breaks away from the reductionist view that we're isolated individuals shaped only by chance or environment. Instead, it tells us we are born into a shared symbolic tapestry made of images, stories, and forms that existed long before us and will outlive us. The collective unconscious, then, is the archetypal dimension of the soul, and this has profound meaning. When we dream of a great mother, a hero in battle, or a shadow that follows us, we're not just expressing personal emotions. We're touching universal structures that speak to the essence of being human. Jung observed that myths and symbols found in religions and cultures across time were not mere social inventions. They were direct manifestations of the collective unconscious. Christ, Buddha, Prometheus, the trickster, the great mother, the dragon, the tree of life. These symbols appear again and again because they represent fundamental human experiences: birth, death, transformation, conflict, redemption. In this sense, Jung's thinking aligns with Joseph Campbell's later work on the monomyth, the hero's journey, the universal narrative pattern found in myths around the world. Campbell's theory echoed Jung's insight. All these stories emerge from a shared symbolic source, the collective unconscious. This concept also touches something deeply spiritual. For Jung, the collective unconscious was the root of genuine religious experience. He believed that God, as an archetypal symbol, isn't simply an external deity or church doctrine, but a living inner experience, numinous and transformative. True religion, he said, arises from within, from the sacred energy that wells up from the depths of the collective unconscious. Still, Jung was careful not to turn this into mysticism. He saw the collective unconscious as a scientific hypothesis, grounded in clinical observation and the study of myths, religions, symbols, and dreams. But it was a hypothesis that required openness, a willingness to admit that not everything meaningful can be measured or explained by reason alone. That's why the idea still challenges people today. It shakes the rationalist mindset that dominated 20th century science. Jung claimed there is a kind of knowledge within the psyche that doesn't come from culture or personal experience, but from a deeper symbolic source. This is the heart of Jung's thought. Symbols are alive. They aren't mere human inventions. They shape and guide us. Symbols born from the collective unconscious have the power to heal, transform, and orient the psyche. They reveal the inner dialogue between consciousness and the larger soul. The collective unconscious is also a teacher. It educates us through images, sensations, and experiences that words can't fully express. It reminds us that we are human, part of a shared story, and that forces greater than the ego move within us. For Jung, the ego is like a small boat floating on a vast ocean. It helps us navigate daily life, but it can't ignore the deep currents of the unconscious without getting lost. When the ego becomes too isolated, too rigid, too rational, it loses touch with the symbolic, and the soul begins to suffer. That's why one of Jungian psychology's main goals is to restore dialogue between the ego and the collective unconscious. Healing, for Jung, doesn't mean erasing the unconscious, but integrating it, recognizing its wisdom, interpreting its symbols, and welcoming its archetypes. In our modern age of technology, speed, and shallow information, this idea is more relevant than ever. Jung reminds us that beneath the noise and the masks we wear lies an ancient symbolic language, older than any civilization, still alive in our dreams, fears, and stories. It connects us all, as if humanity were one great soul dreaming through billions of individuals. When Jung proposed the idea of the collective unconscious, he wasn't just advancing psychology, he was reviving a philosophical tradition, especially Plato's metaphysics. Plato taught that behind visible reality exist universal, eternal, invisible forms. Jung echoed that same truth in psychological terms. There are primordial images that shape human experience, not created, but inherited. For Plato, the world we perceive with our senses is only a reflection of a higher reality, the world of ideas or forms. These forms are objective and timeless. Justice, beauty, courage, love. Everything we experience in the material world is just a shadow of those eternal patterns. Jung realized that this same logic applied to the inner world. Just as there are forms that structure outer reality, there are psychic forms that structure our inner one. He called them archetypes, living forms of the soul expressed through myths, dreams, art, and religion. He wrote, "Archetypes are eternal and universal forms that repeat themselves everywhere and at all times." So, just as Plato saw the visible world as a reflection of invisible ideas, Jung saw consciousness as a mirror that reflects, or distorts, the deeper contents of the collective unconscious. The difference is that for Jung, the gateway to these eternal forms wasn't pure reason, but symbolic experience, through dreams, art, and introspection. Take the symbol of the mother, for example. Every culture portrays it differently. Isis in Egypt, Mary in Christianity, Gaia in Greece, Pachamama in the Andes. But behind them all lies the same archetypal structure, the nurturing, protective, and life-giving mother, and also her darker, devouring side. No one invents this symbol. It emerges spontaneously within the psyche, expressing a reality that's both deeply personal and universally human. Jung saw the collective unconscious as an ontological dimension of the mind, not just a function, but part of what being human means. In this, he was close to Immanuel Kant, who argued that our perception of the world is shaped by inborn categories of thought, like time and space. Jung extended this idea. There are also symbolic categories, archetypes, that shape how we feel, dream, create, and find meaning. From this perspective, Jung built a symbolic philosophy of the psyche. The collective unconscious isn't just a storehouse of images. It's a living field of meaning, an ancestral source of wisdom guiding us through life. It's a transpersonal layer of the soul that contains what we all share as human beings, the universal search for connection and purpose. This idea is not only philosophical, but also deeply ethical. In an age of fragmentation and extreme individualism, Jung reminds us that we belong to something larger, that beneath our differences, there is a shared symbolic heritage uniting us as one humanity. There's something profoundly comforting about this. The pain we feel, the fears we face, the hopes that move us, none of them belong only to us. They're part of a shared human story that echoes through time. The fallen hero, the guiding sage, the nurturing mother, the struggle between chaos and order. These myths live inside every one of us. Jung also said the collective unconscious acts as a compensating force, balancing the one-sidedness of the conscious mind. If society becomes too materialistic or rational, the unconscious answers with spiritual dreams, symbols, or even crises that force us to remember the soul. It doesn't punish, it corrects, it restores balance. In this, Jung echoed ancient philosophers like Heraclitus, who said reality is made of opposing forces, day and night, war and peace, life and death. And that harmony comes not from avoiding tension, but from embracing it. Jung's archetypes work the same way. Anima and Animus, shadow and persona, ego and self. The psyche, he said, is dynamic, paradoxical, and must be listened to in its entirety. The collective unconscious is also a bridge between psychology and religion. For Jung, great religious symbols, the cross, the mandala, the serpent, the light, are not mere inventions of culture, but expressions of archetypal truths. They change shape through time and culture, but they always point to the same human longing, the search for wholeness, meaning, and the sacred. That's why Jung said that God is an archetype of the self, the inner image of totality that unites all opposites within us. He wasn't denying faith, he was describing how the divine reveals itself through experience, not as doctrine, but as a living symbol. Jung was also influenced by Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, both of whom believed in unconscious forces driving life beyond our control. But unlike their pessimism, Jung saw these forces as something we could integrate, and that this integration was the very purpose of life. Ultimately, his vision was profoundly hopeful. The collective unconscious, with all its myths and symbols, isn't a burden. It's the hidden language of the soul. Through it, we find clues to who we are, why we suffer, and how we can become whole. Jung said, "Myths are the spontaneous expressions of the collective unconscious, and the study of mythology is the study of the soul." That's the key. Studying myths, dreams, and symbols isn't escaping reality. It's returning to the deepest reality, the one that modern reason has forgotten. It's a reconnection with the soul of the world, and with our own. The collective unconscious, then, isn't just a psychological theory. It's an existential revelation. It invites us to trust that there's wisdom in the darkness, that the symbols that visit us aren't random, that the soul speaks if we only listen. All we have to do is find the courage to dive into that inner ocean, the same ocean that has carried humanity's dreams, fears, and hopes since the dawn of time. Within the vast universe of Carl Gustav Jung's psychology, few ideas are as fundamental and as fascinating as archetypes. To understand them, we have to let go of the notion that the mind is only the result of personal experience. Jung invites us to look deeper into the collective unconscious, that ancestral layer of the psyche where universal forms of thought, feeling, and behavior live. Archetypes aren't cultural inventions or personal memories. They're innate psychic structures, patterns of perception and expression that have always been part of humanity, regardless of time, place, or culture. They appear in ancient myths, fairy tales, religions, art, and more subtly in our dreams, visions, and inner impulses. Jung described archetypes as formal tendencies, shapes without fixed content that become real through our individual experiences, taking form as symbols, emotions, or recurring characters. They are invisible molds that shape how we see the world, how we react to it, and how we understand ourselves as human beings. A simple example is the mother archetype. Every culture has maternal images: Isis in Egypt, Mary in Christianity, the Earth Mother in indigenous mythologies, Gaia in ancient Greece. Psychologically, this archetype expresses our longing for protection, nourishment, and belonging, but also its darker side, the devouring, suffocating, or controlling mother. On an archetypal level, the mother is not just the woman who gave us birth. It is a universal principle of origin and connection to life. Another central figure is the hero, found in every epic, from Gilgamesh to Superman. The hero embodies the human drive for courage, transformation, and victory over adversity. It's what makes us rise after failure, fight injustice, and face the unknown. On the inner journey, the hero descends into the depths of the unconscious, confronts his own demons, and returns transformed. In many ways, the hero is the ego's path toward individuation. The shadow is one of the most unsettling archetypes. It represents everything we deny, repress, or refuse to accept in ourselves. Negative traits, destructive impulses, but also undeveloped talents and forgotten potential. The shadow is the other within us, the part we often project onto others. Facing it is one of the hardest tasks of inner life. We also encounter the wise old man, the mentor, the spiritual guide, the figure of wisdom and insight. He appears as Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, Dumbledore in Harry Potter, or Socrates in Plato's dialogues. Internally, he is the voice of deep intuition, calm reason, and ancient knowledge that emerges when the ego learns to listen. Another essential archetype is Anima and Animus, the feminine in a man's psyche and the masculine in a woman's. They represent not only the inner image of the opposite sex, but also the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. They connect us to emotion, sensitivity, reason, and also to our deepest relational conflicts. But archetypes aren't a static gallery of mythic characters. They are living, dynamic forces that shift with culture, life stage, and psychological growth. The same archetype can appear as light or shadow, as healing or destruction, depending on how conscious we are of it. Jung used a powerful metaphor. Archetypes are like the dry riverbeds of ancient streams, where the water of human experience continues to flow. They are the well-worn paths the soul has traveled many times, and where life naturally moves. But when ignored or repressed, they can turn against us, appearing as compulsions, obsessions, or destructive patterns. That's why Jung insisted on developing a conscious relationship with our archetypes. It's not enough to know them intellectually. We must engage with them emotionally and symbolically. We do this by paying attention to our dreams, to stories that move us, to art, spirituality, and imagination. Archetypes are not ideas. They are psychic energies. Philosophically, archetypes resemble Plato's ideas, eternal, universal forms that shape reality. But while Plato located these ideas in a transcendent realm accessible through reason, Jung placed them within the human soul, accessible not by logic, but by symbol, myth, and dream. This shift is crucial. For Jung, true knowledge of the soul doesn't come from rational thought. It comes from listening to the symbolic language that lives within us. Archetypes are like ancient voices still speaking inside each of us, even when we've forgotten their origin. That's why they appear in dreams, in spontaneous fantasies, in religious imagery, in rituals, and in stories that move us for reasons we can't explain. They teach us silently about life, love, death, and meaning. They are inner maps, spiritual compasses, mirrors where the collective soul reflects itself in the individual soul. Jung said, "The archetype is like the riverbed, and the psychic content is the water that flows through it." In other words, the form is ancient, but the content is always new. Each person fills archetypal patterns with their own culture, story, and emotions. The hero, for example, may appear as a warrior to a young man seeking courage, as a martyr to someone fighting injustice, or as an entrepreneur to someone creating something new. The structure is universal, but the expression is personal. That's why archetypes are both universal and individual. They connect us to humanity as a whole, yet they reveal the most intimate parts of our inner life. Understanding archetypes isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's an essential step toward individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are. As long as we remain unaware of the archetypes shaping us, we're ruled by them unconsciously. We become dominated by the shadow, trapped by the persona, seduced by the negative anima or animus, or paralyzed by the hero's impossible quest. But once we recognize these patterns, once we start to dialogue with them instead of fighting them, we become more integrated, more self-aware, more human. That's the essence of Jung's message. Don't fight the archetypes. Integrate them, not as absolute truths, but as symbolic pathways to self-knowledge. They don't tell us who to be. They reveal the forces that live within us and how we can express them creatively and consciously. Studying archetypes, then, isn't just studying psychology. It's studying the human soul in its deepest expression. It's learning to listen to myths again, to honor symbols, and to recognize that there's something in us greater than the ego, something that connects us to wholeness, ancestry, and the sacred. And perhaps that's Jung's greatest lesson. To truly know ourselves, we must dive into the symbolic ocean where the archetypes live, not as tourists of the mind, but as sailors of the soul. When Carl Gustav Jung introduced the concept of archetypes, he wasn't just describing psychological structures. He was proposing a new metaphysics of the psyche. For him, archetypes were not just inherited images or mythical figures. They were fundamental patterns of the soul, shaping how we perceive, feel, act, and find meaning. They are, at their core, a priori forms of human experience. This idea parallels the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, one of modernity's greatest thinkers. Kant argued that we never know the world as it is in itself, only as it appears to us through the structures of the mind. Our consciousness is organized by inborn categories, like time, space, and causality, that shape all experience. In other words, it's not the world that gives form to the mind, but the mind that gives form to the world. Inspired by this, Jung proposed that beyond these rational categories, there are also symbolic and emotional structures that organize the experience of the soul. These are the archetypes. If Kant spoke of the categories of understanding, Jung spoke of the categories of imagination, of the symbolic and the unconscious. The archetype, then, is a psychic framework that exists before experience, but becomes visible through dreams, myths, symbols, and emotions. The difference lies in the language. Kant's categories are abstract. Jung's archetypes speak through images, metaphors, and stories. They don't explain, they express. For example, the hero archetype isn't a fixed idea. It's a living pattern that appears as Odysseus, Moses, Joan of Arc, Jesus, Frodo, or anyone who faces darkness, endures trials, and returns transformed. It keeps reappearing because it reflects a universal structure of the human experience, a symbolic pattern that helps us make sense of struggle and transformation. Archetypes are living forms of imagination. They shape how the psyche approaches the great themes of life: birth, death, love, struggle, transformation, evil, redemption. That's why they exist in every culture and every era. For Jung, this wasn't coincidence. It was evidence of a shared human soul, a symbolic matrix that predates culture. This view separates him from the empiricist tradition, which saw the mind as a blank slate molded only by experience. Jung believed humans are born with a symbolic blueprint, just as we are born with a physical body. That blueprint is the network of archetypes, the symbolic backdrop on which our inner lives unfold. What makes Jung's vision truly philosophical is its existential and epistemological dimension. Archetypes aren't just psychological, they are pathways to knowledge. They function as inner models through which we give meaning to life. They are, in a sense, structures of meaning, like Plato's ideas, Kant's categories, or Hegel's concepts. Jung's proposal was revolutionary. Human experience is not only rational, it's symbolic. Knowledge doesn't come only through logic, but through myth. He revived an ancient way of knowing, the epistemology of the symbol. For Jung, the symbol is the best possible expression of an inner reality that can't be fully rationalized. A symbol is multivalent, fertile, ambiguous. It points beyond itself, toward mystery. Archetypes are the great universal symbols that rise from the collective unconscious to guide the conscious mind toward wholeness. This has profound implications for how we see existence. Humanity doesn't become whole through reason alone, but by integrating the symbolic contents of the unconscious. Archetypes are gateways to that integration. They confront us with forgotten aspects of ourselves and push us toward balance and self-realization. In this sense, Jung reconnected modern thought with the ancient philosophical tradition of myth. For the Greeks, myth wasn't fiction, it was a form of truth, a symbolic way to express reality's deepest structures. Jung restored that view. For him, myth is the spontaneous expression of archetypes, the soul's narrative language. He wrote, "Myth is a manifestation of the collective unconscious. It is the language of the soul in narrative form. It's as if the soul tells its truth through stories, projecting its struggles, desires, and transformations onto symbolic figures. The hero, the traitor, the great mother, the wise old man, the shadow. Each myth mirrors the inner drama of the human psyche, and the archetypes are the invisible actors performing it. Through this, Jung created a symbolic philosophy of existence. Human life isn't driven only by reason, but by deep symbolic forces that shape our emotions, choices, and sense of meaning. Ignoring these forces, he warned, leads to spiritual poverty, a disconnection from the language of the soul. He saw modern civilization's crisis as a loss of the symbol. Science gave us power, but also left us disconnected from the sacred dimension of life. We lost the myths that once gave meaning to existence, and with them, the ability to hear the soul. In this, Jung echoes Nietzsche, who saw the death of myth and religion as a crisis of meaning, Kierkegaard, who valued subjectivity as truth, and Heidegger, who viewed human existence as always immersed in a world already full of meaning. But Jung went even further. He believed meaning doesn't come only from the world. It also comes from within, from the archetypes that live inside us, dreaming and guiding us, even when we're unaware. To know these archetypes is, ultimately, to know ourselves. This kind of self-knowledge isn't easy. It requires symbolic listening, inner work, and the acceptance of paradox. It demands humility, courage, and openness to mystery. That's why studying archetypes isn't just an intellectual pursuit, it's a spiritual practice. When we start recognizing the symbolic patterns shaping our lives, we move out of unconsciousness into deeper awareness. We begin to hear not only our thoughts, but the ancestral language of the soul. That's what makes archetypes more than a psychological concept. They are bridges between philosophy and psychology, between myth and reason, between the individual and the collective. They are the symbolic forms of the human condition. By recognizing them, we don't just understand our inner world more clearly, we reconnect with the soul of humanity itself. If there's one central thread running through all of Carl Gustav Jung's work, it's the process of individuation. For Jung, the ultimate goal of human life isn't fleeting happiness or surface-level adaptation to society. It's the realization of the totality of being. This inner journey toward the center of the psyche is what he called individuation. To individuate doesn't mean to isolate yourself or become self-centered. It means becoming who you truly are, not in appearance, not in your social role, and not in what others expect of you, but in your deepest essence, in contact with the self, the archetype of wholeness. Jung saw this as the soul's most intimate and sacred calling. Individuation is, therefore, a symbolic, psychological, and existential journey in which consciousness encounters the unconscious, recognizes its contents, integrates inner opposites, and moves toward the unification of the psyche. Jung wrote, "Individuation means becoming an individual, a single, indivisible being. And yet, to become yourself is, paradoxically, to become what is most universal." That line captures the heart of his idea. The more authentic we become, the more deeply human we are. Individuation doesn't separate us from the world. It connects us to it in a deeper, more meaningful way. But what exactly does this process involve? To individuate, first we must recognize that the ego, the conscious part of the psyche, is not the whole. It's important, yes, but it's only a fraction of the soul. The unconscious, with its archetypes, symbols, impulses, and images, is just as alive as the ego. Psychological health depends on creating a conscious relationship between these two realms. The process begins when the ego, once identified with collective values and social expectations, starts to sense that there's something more, something stirring in the depths of the soul demanding to be heard. This something might appear through dreams, existential anxiety, inner restlessness, or symptoms that have no external cause. It's the unconscious knocking, bringing messages that need to be understood. At that moment, inner conflict usually begins. The path of individuation isn't easy. It requires facing everything the ego would rather avoid: fears, repressed desires, old wounds, and, most importantly, the shadow, the darker side of the personality, containing both what we reject and what we've never developed. But that confrontation is where real growth begins. Individuation isn't about denying the shadow. It's about integrating it consciously. As Jung said, no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This inner journey resembles the hero's journey from mythology. There's a call, a crossing of thresholds, encounters with monsters, a fall, a revelation, and a return transformed. Except here, the entire adventure happens inside the psyche, as unconscious material is integrated through dreams, therapy, art, introspection, or symbolic experiences. The ego begins to change position. It's no longer the king of the psyche, but a servant of the self, aware of its limits, and open to the greater totality within. The self is the center and totality of the psyche, something that transcends the ego, but also contains it. It represents harmony, completeness, and the reconciliation of opposites. And it's toward this self that individuation leads. Jung saw this as a natural, almost organic process. Just as the body matures, so does the soul. But psychological growth requires conscious participation. It doesn't happen automatically. It takes effort, attention, and surrender. That's why individuation is also an ethical, spiritual, and philosophical task. Ethical, because it involves responsibility to one's own truth. Spiritual, because it leads to encounters with the mystery of the self, often expressed through sacred images, mandalas, or numinous experiences. And philosophical, because it forces us to ask, who am I? Beyond my name, my job, my persona. Jung was influenced by traditions that viewed life as an inner journey. Taoism's balance of opposites, Hinduism's idea of Atman as the true self, Gnosticism's call to self-knowledge, and the Greek philosophy of Socrates, who taught that knowing oneself is the key to wisdom. But Jung's approach is unique because of its symbolic dimension. He doesn't ask us to follow a doctrine. He invites us to live an inner experience. The self isn't a dogma, but a living image, manifesting uniquely in each person as the organizing center of the psyche, guiding the soul toward its destiny. The journey isn't linear. There are advances and setbacks, crises and rebirths. The ego resists, sometimes collapses, but the soul keeps calling, sending signals, seeking expression. When we finally listen, something within begins to align. Individuation isn't perfection, it's integration. It's not about becoming ideal, but becoming whole. It's recognizing that we're made of many voices, impulses, and feelings, and only by embracing them can we live authentically. Throughout this process, archetypes appear as guides and challenges. The Great Mother, the hero, the anima, the shadow, the wise old man. They show up as living images that teach, confront, and reveal. The inner work is to recognize and dialogue with them, to listen and integrate. Thus, individuation is also symbolic maturity. The inner child, the wound, the persona, the dreams, all become material for self-discovery. Life shifts from being a series of external demands to a field of inner meaning. And when that happens, a person begins to radiate something different, more presence, depth, and compassion. Not because they've become perfect, but because they've learned to live consciously. For Jung, this was the true purpose of life. What really matters is fulfilling the destiny of the soul to become who you truly are. Individuation, then, isn't just a psychological concept. It's a philosophy of life. It's a way of living with truth, awareness, and connection to the mystery of existence. It's a journey each of us must make alone, but it connects us all, because deep down, every soul shares the same search for wholeness. For Jung, individuation wasn't only a psychological process, it was a transformative, existential quest. At its core, it's an inner calling, a summons from the soul to stop living in fragments and begin seeking completeness. Jung saw this as a reflection of one of humanity's oldest and most universal stories, the hero's journey. The mythic hero isn't born a hero. He's called into the unknown. Often, unwillingly, he crosses borders, faces monsters, descends into the underworld, dies symbolically, and is reborn, transformed. Each challenge, each confrontation, each symbolic death leads to greater wholeness. The same pattern unfolds inside the human psyche. Individuation is the journey of the inner hero. The battles are internal, the confrontation with the shadow, the meeting with archetypes, the dialogue with the unconscious. It's the most dangerous and most necessary adventure of life. Early in adulthood, most people live guided by the ego, pursuing careers, approval, and belonging. We wear the persona, the social mask that helps us function in society. But over time, a subtle dissatisfaction appears, a feeling that we're just playing roles. That's when the call to individuation begins. Like in myths, there's a call to adventure. It might come through a crisis, a dream, a loss, or emotional exhaustion. Life forces us inward, and what we've been avoiding starts to surface. The first figure we usually meet on this path is the shadow. The shadow holds everything we don't accept in ourselves: fear, anger, jealousy, but also forgotten talents and repressed creativity. Jung said, "The shadow is 90% gold. It's not only darkness, it's what was denied and now must be reclaimed." Facing the shadow is like confronting the dragon in myth. It's meeting the parts of ourselves we'd rather project onto others. It hurts because the ego must give up its illusions of control and superiority. But this confrontation is essential. Without it, the soul grows sick. We project what we hate in ourselves onto the world and live in constant inner conflict. As we face the shadow, the ego begins to mature. It recognizes that it's not the center of the universe. There are greater, wiser forces within. That's when other archetypes begin to emerge, not as theories, but as living experiences. The hero encounters the wise old man, who offers guidance. He meets the anima or animus, challenging him to integrate the feminine or masculine within. He faces symbolic dreams and recurring images that both disturb and enlighten. These are the turning points of the inner journey, the moments that mark deep transformation. At this stage, individuation becomes the reconciliation of opposites, reason and intuition, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, pain and potential. All must be brought into awareness and accepted. That's the essence of individuation, not eliminating parts of ourselves, but integrating them. Jung said, individuation is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. To be whole means to live with tension, contradiction, and paradox. It means accepting that we are many, and yet seeking unity that doesn't erase but embraces that diversity. Eventually, the individual begins to sense the self, the regulating center of the psyche, the inner image of divine wholeness. The self is like the inner God of the ancients, not an external being, but the living symbol of completeness that resides within us. This encounter often appears in dreams as a child, a mandala, a precious stone, or radiant light. Its presence transforms, not by replacing the ego, but by putting it in its rightful place, as part of the whole, not its ruler. From then on, a person lives differently. Their actions become more aligned with their inner truth. They can return to the world, but with new eyes, with the memory of the inner journey alive within them. They become freer, more creative, more compassionate, because they no longer need to defend themselves from who they are. This existential dimension of individuation echoes deeply through philosophy. Socrates and the call to self-knowledge, Nietzsche and the idea of becoming who you are, Kierkegaard and authenticity as an act of faith, Heidegger and the demand for authentic existence in the face of being. But Jung went beyond them all, offering not only ideas, but a symbolic map of the inner journey. It's not linear, not prescriptive. Each person must travel it in their own way, in their own time, through their own symbols. That's the beauty and the difficulty of individuation. There are no recipes, no guarantees. The path is unique for everyone, and precisely for that reason, it's sacred. It demands courage to look inward, humility to accept fragmentation, patience to listen to the unconscious, and faith, not in a religious sense, but as trust that the soul knows the way. Jung believed this is life's great task. While many live only on the surface, chasing success and validation, the individuating person seeks something deeper, meaning. Not meaning imposed from outside, but one that arises from listening to the self. That meaning is not fixed, it unfolds gradually, like a living myth. Because, like the hero, we're always in motion. Individuation never truly ends. It continues throughout life as the soul keeps expanding, seeking fuller expression. Jung said, the unlived life is a disease of the soul. And that might be the greatest danger of avoiding individuation, living only on the surface, repeating patterns we didn't choose, fleeing from the truth that calls from within. Individuation, then, is an act of love for oneself, a return to the inner home, a recognition that wholeness matters more than perfection. And at the end of this long journey, we don't find a new self. We finally meet the truest version of who we've always been. If there's one concept in Carl Gustav Jung's psychology that hits us directly, and often uncomfortably, it's the shadow. Not just because it exposes what we'd rather keep hidden, but because it demands a radical kind of honesty with ourselves. For Jung, the shadow is the unconscious side of our personality. It holds everything the ego denies, represses, rejects, or forgets. But the shadow isn't just the bad side of human nature. It includes dark aspects like envy, anger, pride, and destructive impulses. But it also hides unrealized potential, buried talents, and genuine desires silenced by fear, shame, or social norms. In other words, the shadow isn't only darkness, it's hidden power. Jung wrote, "The shadow is that part of ourselves we wish did not exist, but which belongs to us most deeply. We all have a shadow. It's inseparable from being human. It forms as we grow up and learn which behaviors are accepted and which are not. From childhood, we're taught to repress certain emotions, hides certain actions, and denies certain impulses. We create the persona, the social mask, to be loved, accepted, and valued. And everything that doesn't fit this mask, everything we label as ugly, wrong, or dangerous, gets pushed into the basement of the psyche, into the unconscious. That's where the shadow is born. The problem is that even forgotten, it doesn't disappear. On the contrary, it quietly influences our thoughts, choices, emotions, and relationships. Often, when we react too strongly, when we feel irrational anger or judge someone harshly, we're actually projecting our own shadow onto them. Projection is one of the most dangerous and most common mechanisms of the unconscious. Everything we refuse to see in ourselves, we end up seeing in others, co-workers, partners, parents, politicians, or social groups we dislike. This is how the shadow secretly governs the world, hidden behind accusations, resentment, polarization, and conflict. But the shadow isn't the enemy. Jung was clear. It's not meant to be destroyed, but integrated. Integrating the shadow is one of the most crucial steps in the process of individuation, the journey toward wholeness. Because as long as we ignore the shadow, we live a fragmented, partial life, dominated by illusion. Facing the shadow takes courage. The courage to say, "This is also me." The courage to let go of the idealized self-image, step down from the ego's pedestal, and face what's been hidden. Jung compared this to the mythic descent into the underworld, like Inanna descending into the depths, or Orpheus searching for Eurydice. Going down into the soul's darkness is where real transformation begins. The shadow also appears in dreams, as threatening figures, pursuers, wild animals, or terrifying characters. Jung said these shouldn't be taken literally, but symbolically, they represent parts of ourselves that need recognition. The monster in the dream may be our unexpressed anger, denied sexuality, or repressed creativity. And here's the key. The shadow isn't just negative. Often, it guards hidden treasures. What we've silenced out of fear may hold the most vitality and authenticity within us. The artist who never allowed himself to create. The leader who learned to suppress her strength. The healer who buried their sensitivity. These are dark potentials, light hidden behind fear. The shadow also has a collective dimension. Jung saw many examples of large-scale shadow projections throughout history. Wars, religious persecution, racism, xenophobia. These are expressions of humanity's inability to face its own darkness. Instead of integrating it, societies project evil onto the other, the outsider, the different. Unacknowledged, the shadow ends up ruling entire civilizations in the name of morality. That's why Jung considered the integration of the shadow not just a personal task, but an ethical imperative. True change in the world begins with inner transformation. As long as individuals refuse to face their own shadows, they'll keep recreating conflict through denial. Practically, integrating the shadow means paying attention to what disturbs us, what hurts, what scares us. It means observing our projections, acknowledging uncomfortable emotions, and giving a symbolic place to our inner voices. It's not about acting impulsively, it's about recognizing what's there and bringing it into consciousness. This process doesn't happen overnight. It's a lifelong journey, sometimes painful, but deeply freeing. The more we recognize our shadow, the less it controls us, and the closer we move toward authenticity, maturity, and inner freedom. Philosophically, the shadow is tied to the paradox of being human. As conscious beings, we seek light, clarity, and goodness. But we're also driven by impulses, desires, and emotions that don't match our self-image. We live in a constant tension between light and dark. This paradox isn't new. Heraclitus spoke of the unity of opposites. Plato's allegory of the cave showed that the path to truth requires leaving the shadows, but also recognizing their role in the journey. Nietzsche warned that whoever fights monsters should see to it that he does not become one. And Jung, continuing that tradition, reminded us that wholeness only comes when we embrace our duality. The shadow, then, is a door to self-knowledge. It reveals not just what we hide, but who we are when we stop performing. It challenges us to drop our masks and listen to the soul, not as an ideal, but as truth. Jung said, "Meeting the shadow is the hardest lesson in life, but it's also the beginning of freedom. What truly imprisons us isn't the world outside, it's our refusal to look within. The shadow is the dark mirror that holds both our pain and our power. It doesn't vanish through denial. It transforms through awareness. And that awareness marks the start of true transformation. When the shadow stops being the enemy and becomes an ally, it gives us access to immense creative energy. What was repressed demands expression, and once it finds a voice, the soul can finally breathe. In this sense, the shadow is also a source of creativity. Many artists, writers, and thinkers turned their own darkness into art, philosophy, or beauty. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean suppressing the impulse. It means giving it form, consciously and symbolically. Thus, the shadow stops being a threat and becomes raw material for growth, the place where light begins, where the fragmented self starts returning home, where the hero meets the dragon not to destroy it, but to realize it was guarding the gold. Working with the shadow isn't just a psychological process. It's also an ethical duty. To face, confront, and integrate it is a moral responsibility, because everything we fail to recognize in ourselves, we end up projecting onto others, fueling the judgments, prejudices, and polarizations we see everywhere. Without self-awareness, we remain strangers to ourselves and inevitably at war with the world. Jung put it bluntly, "He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens." But awakening isn't easy. It means facing the hardest parts of ourselves, our aggression, shame, hidden desires, all that the ego rejects because it doesn't fit the perfect image we've built. Jung shows that denying these parts doesn't erase them. It just drives them underground, where they continue acting out, often destructively. When unacknowledged, the shadow seeps into our relationship. We blame others for what belongs to us. The jealous person sees betrayal everywhere. The arrogant one accuses others of pride. The envious person condemns vanity. The less aware we are of our shadow, the more moralistic and intolerant we become. This is a painful truth, but also a liberating one. Because when we realize that the monsters we see outside often reflect our own inner monsters, we can finally begin to heal, integrate, and transform that energy into something creative. Jung believed that no real change happens without this confrontation. Consciousness can't grow while clinging to moral innocence, or the illusion that we're good and others are bad. The reality of the soul is more complex. We all contain both light and shadow. Ethics, therefore, isn't about denying the shadow. It's about integrating it consciously. That's revolutionary. Traditional morality often depends on repression, controlling bad impulses, striving to be good, obeying external rules. Jung proposed something far deeper, a symbolic ethics born within the psyche, based not on blind obedience, but on awareness and wholeness. And that kind of ethics takes courage. The courage to drop the mask, to see your own darkness in the mirror, to stop blaming others for your inner conflicts. That's true maturity, taking responsibility for what we project onto the world. This doesn't mean excusing evil or accepting injustice. On the contrary, it means realizing that before we fight darkness outside, we must confront it within. The seeds of intolerance, fear, aggression, vanity, and greed exist in all of us. Only those who recognize their own darkness are free from being ruled by it. Here, Jung connects with a long line of philosophers. Socrates taught that ignorance of oneself is the root of all error. Augustine spoke of the inner battle between light and shadow. Nietzsche warned of becoming what we fight. Kierkegaard showed that anxiety arises from confronting the hidden possibilities within us, including the dark ones. Jung stands among them, but he brought this wisdom into psychology. He showed that true ethics begins with self-knowledge, and self-knowledge inevitably passes through the shadow. He once wrote, "The heaviest burden of existence is to live an unlived life, and part of that unlived life lies in what we've buried in the shadow, the gifts, emotions, and desires we were taught to reject." Integrating the shadow is, therefore, an act of self-love, a rescue mission for the parts of ourselves that still wait to be seen. This makes the shadow not just a challenge, but also a path of healing. When we start listening to what the shadow wants to tell us through dreams, conflicts, or symptoms, we begin to understand the symbolic logic of the soul. Each rejected piece carries a message, a key, a vital energy. Unacknowledged, that energy turns against us, becoming compulsion, rigidity, or pain. But once accepted, it transforms into creativity, strength, and presence. Integrating the shadow means no longer being a victim of yourself. It's taking ownership of your inner life. Jung said the shadow is like a twin brother, banished from the kingdom of consciousness, who one day returns to claim his place on the throne. That return can be chaotic, or it can be transformative. It all depends on the attitude of consciousness. If it resists, conflict grows. If it listens, the path opens. That's why, in analytical psychology, confronting the shadow is a central stage of individuation. Without it, there's no wholeness, no maturity. To be whole is to see yourself clearly and still love what you see. The shadow never disappears, but once recognized, it loses its destructive power. It becomes an ally, a reminder of our humanity, our limits, and our capacity to grow. As Jung said, the shadow does not vanish, but once it is recognized, it becomes a friend instead of a demon. This is Jung's ethics, an ethics of looking inward, a way of understanding that peace in the world begins with peace within, that real dialogue with others begins with dialogue with oneself, that respect for difference is born from accepting our own contradictions. In a time of polarization, superficiality, and fragmentation, this ethical call is more relevant than ever. Integrating the shadow isn't just a personal practice, it's a political, spiritual, and civilizational act, because the world we build is a reflection of the inner world we carry. And real change will only begin when more people find the courage to descend into their own depths, not to get lost there, but to emerge more whole. At the heart of Carl Gustav Jung's psychology lies a quiet, profound, mysterious symbol, one that is absolutely essential. This symbol is the self. For Jung, the self is not just a theoretical concept, it's the fullest expression of the human soul, the totality of the psyche that unites every part of our being. The self is, at once, both the origin and the destination of the psyche. Jung defines the self as the archetype of wholeness. It's the symbolic image of what we truly are in essence, though we have not yet become it fully. While the ego is the center of consciousness, the self is the center of the entire psyche, including both the conscious and the unconscious. In other words, the self transcends the ego. It's broader, deeper, wiser. It's like an inner sun around which all elements of the psyche orbit: desires, feelings, archetypes, memories, impulses, contradictions. The ego tries to organize experience, but it is the self that organizes the ego. Jung wrote, "The self is the center and totality of the psyche. It is the archetype that represents the realization of the whole, the union of opposites, the point where all the paths of the soul converge." This idea radically changes how we see ourselves. In classical psychology, the ego is supreme, the seat of identity. But for Jung, the ego is only a fragment of the total psyche, and its real purpose is to become aware of that larger totality. In other words, to serve the self. This relationship between ego and self is key to understanding the journey of self-knowledge. In early life, the ego develops by adapting to the external world. It learns to name, plan, compete, and achieve. But as life goes on, a quiet unease begins to grow. Who am I beyond the roles I play? That's when the self starts to manifest, often through dreams, symbols, crises, or intuition. It calls the ego to turn inward. The self, then, isn't something we possess. It's a reality that inhabits us. It's not something we can grasp through rational effort. It's something revealed through deep listening. It's a silent center already within us, one that only unveils itself as we integrate the opposing forces that make us who we are. And that is one of the most important aspects of the self. It is the symbol of the union of opposites. Jung believed that the human psyche is full of polarities, light and shadow, reason and intuition, masculine and feminine, persona and unconscious, consciousness and instinct. Most people identify with only one side of these pairs and reject or repress the other, which leads to fragmentation, rigidity, and suffering. The self, by contrast, embraces all parts. It's the living totality that harmonizes opposites without erasing them. It doesn't seek false perfection, but genuine wholeness, alive, dynamic, and full of tension, yet integrated. Jung said, "The self is the whole that holds its parts in creative tension." This is symbolized in many ancient images. The yin-yang of Taoism, for example, shows that each polarity carries within it the seed of its opposite. Or the mandala, the circular geometric figure that represents the unifying center of the psyche. Jung saw such symbols appearing in dreams, visions, and spiritual traditions around the world as spontaneous expressions of the self. It's important to understand that the self is not the ideal self, the perfect image we chase to please others or meet social expectations. The self isn't an external goal, it's an inner reality, always present, waiting to be recognized. It doesn't demand that we become something different, it invites us to become whole. In Jung's process of individuation, the self is both the origin and the destination. It's the organizing center that guides psychic development, provokes necessary crises, inspires symbols, and moves the soul towards authenticity. At the same time, it's also the point of arrival, the moment when the ego is reconciled with the whole. Often, the self makes its presence felt as an inner impulse, an intuition, a silent voice whispering, "You are not whole yet." Other times, it appears in dreams as sacred figures, radiant children, wise elders, archetypal animals, or cosmic images. These should not be taken literally. They are symbolic expressions of the self communicating with consciousness. Relating to the self requires deep listening. Listening beyond logic, beneath the noise of the ego, into the quiet space where the soul speaks. The goal isn't to control the self, but to open to it, with humility and courage. Jung believed that many psychological illnesses arise from disconnection from the self. When the ego becomes too autonomous, believing it can control everything, it loses contact with the deeper center of the psyche. Then come anxiety, depression, emptiness, identity confusion. The path to healing, Jung said, isn't to strengthen the ego further, but to reconnect it with the self, the source of meaning and coherence in life. That's why the self also has a spiritual dimension, not in a dogmatic or religious sense, but in a symbolic one. The self is like an inner image of the divine, not a god outside us, but a sacred center within. Many spiritual traditions describe this reality. The Atman in Hinduism, the Christ within in Christian mysticism, the divine spark in Kabbalah, the Tao. Jung saw these as cultural expressions of the same archetypal experience, the encounter with the self. And that encounter is transformative. When the ego bows before the self, something shifts. Life gains more meaning, direction, and coherence. Choices align more closely with the soul. Even in suffering, there's an inner point of stability, like a quiet compass always pointing to the center. But the self cannot be reached directly. It reveals itself gradually as the ego sheds its illusions, as the shadow is integrated, as the archetypes are recognized, as the persona is stripped away. It's an ongoing process, never complete. The self isn't a destination to be conquered. but a mystery to be lived. That mystery gives depth to existence. It's what separates a life of appearances from a life of authenticity. The self calls us, silently, to live with soul. Jung said, "The self is the totality of the psyche. It represents the unity of conscious and unconscious, of masculine and feminine, of reason and emotion. It is the full self, the realized soul, the whole being." And perhaps that's the great task of every human being, to hear that call, walk through our inner labyrinth, reconcile our opposites, and find, at the center of our psyche, the self, not as an idea, but as a living, sacred experience. In Jung's psychology, the concept of the self goes far beyond theory or clinical use. He saw the self not only as the central archetype of the psyche, but also as a symbol of something sacred and transcendent. In his later years, Jung moved closer to a deeply spiritual and metaphysical view of human nature. The self as an inner image of the ultimate unity of existence, a spark of the divine within the soul. For him, the journey toward the self wasn't just psychological, it was ontological. It touched the very ground of being. It meant transcending the limited, fragmented ego and moving toward a deeper, wiser, more encompassing center, one that unites opposites and reflects a living, sacred wholeness. This vision resonates strongly with both Eastern and Western mysticism, and with humanity's timeless intuition that the soul holds a connection to the divine. Jung saw the self as the living symbol of that connection. He wrote, "The self is a kind of inner God, a totality that transcends us and yet lives within us." This sentence captures the core of Jung's metaphysics. The human being is a meeting point between the finite and the infinite, between consciousness and transcendence. The image of the self expresses that creative tension, but Jung was careful to clarify that the self isn't God in a theological sense. He didn't confuse psychology with religion. The self is a psychic image of the divine, the way humans experience and symbolize unity, wholeness, and the sacred within their own souls. Across cultures, this image takes many forms: the inner Christ, the Atman, the Tao, the Buddha nature, the higher self, the divine spark. All are symbolic ways of expressing the same truth. Something within us transcends the ego and calls us toward a deeper center. This is what makes Jung's thought a symbolic philosophy of the soul. He recognized that the ego, our conscious identity, is necessary but insufficient. The ego manages daily life, but it cannot grasp the mystery of existence. It lives in dualities, right and wrong, light and dark, masculine and feminine. The self, however, integrates these opposites. It is the symbol of unity beyond duality. Thus, the journey toward the self is the transcendence of the ego, not its negation, but its integration. The ego must realize it's not the ruler of the psyche, but its servant. Only then can it align with the self and live in harmony with the soul. Here, Jung finds deep parallels with mystical traditions. In Hinduism, the Atman, the true self, is identical to Brahman, the cosmic absolute. In Sufi Islam, the ego must die so the soul can unite with God. In Christian mysticism, from Meister Eckhart to St. John of the Cross, the I must be emptied so that God can fill the soul. Jung saw all of these as symbolic expressions of individuation, the progressive union between ego and self. But unlike dogmatic religion, Jung didn't preach belief. He invited inner experience. He spoke of the sacred in the language of psychology, through dreams, symbols, and the numinous. The self is the bridge between psychology and spirituality. This view is profoundly metaphysical. It rests on the conviction that beneath the multiplicity of life lies an underlying unity. And that unity is not just an idea. It's something that can be felt, lived, and experienced within the psyche itself. For Jung, life naturally tends toward individuation, the realization of the self. The soul moves toward wholeness, but this requires confronting inner divisions, the shadow, the complexes, the masks. Each step toward truth makes the self clearer, a center that guides, integrates, and transforms. This idea echoes the philosophy of Heraclitus, who saw reality as a harmony of opposites bound by a hidden logos, of Plotinus, who taught that the soul emanates from the one and must return to its source, and of Spinoza, for whom God and nature were one living totality. In all of them, we find the same intuition. The part longs to reunite with the whole. In Jungian thought, that totality is expressed by the self, the God within, not as an external belief, but as an inner experience of unity. For Jung, psychological health depended on this connection. When the ego separates from the self, alienation and loss of meaning arise. When the ego reconnects, there is healing, integration, and existential purpose. Jung also noticed that in life's critical moments, crises, losses, identity breakdowns, the self often emerges most strongly, not to punish, but to awaken. Suffering, paradoxically, can open the door to the self. Only when the ego cracks a little can the self step forward. This experience often feels like death and rebirth, a theme found in myths, fairy tales, and initiation rituals. The hero must die to be reborn as king. The ego must surrender so that the soul may flourish. The self is the new center that rises from that passage. The self cannot be forced. It reveals itself when we are ready. That readiness doesn't come from intellect, but from inner maturity. From the moment we stop trying to control and start to listen. When we let go of who we think we are and open ourselves to what we might become. Jung wrote, "The self is both the goal and the guide of the individuation process. It draws us toward wholeness and at the same time leads us to it." This is a hopeful vision. It suggests that the soul already holds everything it needs to become whole. The self is like a seed already planted within us. We only need to nurture it, trust it, and listen. In a fragmented, image-driven world, Jung's message is quietly revolutionary. It calls us to take the opposite path. Instead of searching outside, look within. Instead of accumulating, integrate. Instead of appearing, be. And in that process, the self is not a prize. It's the journey itself. Every time we embrace an inner contradiction, listen to a symbol, or let go of ego to serve something greater, we move closer to the self. That's why, for Jung, the self is the deepest image of the realized soul, and a timeless reminder that life becomes truly whole only when we become who we are and reconnect with the divine center that lives within us. If we want to truly understand what moves the human soul, we have to go beyond logic, rational words, and linear concepts. The soul, in Carl Gustav Jung's view, doesn't speak the same language as the conscious mind. It speaks through images, symbols, and metaphors. And its clearest, purest, and most revealing voice appears in dreams. For Jung, dreams aren't meaningless noise or leftovers from the day that the brain discards. They are living expressions of the unconscious, and often of the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of the human psyche that contains archetypal images and universal structures of experience. To dream is to listen to the soul. It's to receive messages from the self, from instinct, from ancestral history, from what we don't yet know but already carry within us. Jung once wrote, "The dream is the small hidden door to the deepest and most intimate sanctuary of the soul." That phrase captures the sacredness he attributed to dreams. Not as something magical or superstitious, but as a legitimate, necessary, and deeply meaningful psychic phenomenon. Dreaming is the native language of the unconscious, and the key to understanding it lies in symbols. For Jung, a symbol isn't just any sign. It's not a simple substitution of words or ideas. A symbol is a living image, filled with multiple, often unconscious, meanings. It points towards something that cannot yet be said directly. It expresses what is still taking shape in the soul. And for that reason, every symbol is bigger than its explanation. When we dream of a house, for example, we're not just seeing a building. The house might symbolize the body, the psyche, the many flaws of consciousness, or our roots and ancestry. A river might represent the flow of life, the passage of time, or the unconscious itself. A child might symbolize the emerging self, the rebirth of the soul. It all depends on the symbolic context, on how we listen, and on both personal and archetypal associations. That's why interpreting dreams, in the Jungian sense, isn't about reducing them to formulas. It's an act of deep listening, of active imagination, of dialogue between the ego and the unconscious. Jung believed that each dream is a symbolic message that invites us toward individuation, toward integrating different aspects of the psyche, resolving inner conflicts, and moving closer to wholeness. But to do that, we have to let go of a purely rational way of seeing things and open ourselves to symbolic thinking. This is a key point in Jungian psychology. The unconscious doesn't communicate in linear logic. It speaks in poetic, dramatic, and emotional images, often absurd to the waking mind, but profoundly true to the soul. This is the same language found in mythology, art, and ancient rituals. Entire civilizations have been built upon symbols: the cross, the circle, the serpent, the fire, the mountain. These images don't belong to a single culture. They arise from the collective unconscious, and when they appear in dreams, they bring with them the wisdom of all humanity. In this way, the symbol becomes a bridge between the collective unconscious and individual consciousness. It connects the personal with the universal. It shows us that the pain we feel, or the dilemma we face, isn't just ours, it's human. And that brings comfort, meaning, and transcendence. Jung also emphasized that a symbol shouldn't just be explained, but experienced. What matters most isn't figuring out what a dream means, but feeling what it evokes. What emotions arise? What images echo in us? What associations come to mind? A true symbol isn't interpreted from the outside in. It reveals itself from the inside out. That's why working with dreams is essential to individuation. Dreams show us what the ego can't yet see. They reveal imbalances, omissions, complexes, forgotten potentials. They anticipate crises, point to new directions, and correct distortions. Above all, they reconnect the ego with the self. It's as if the unconscious is constantly trying to restore harmony, and dreams are its messengers. When we become too rigid, dreams bring something new. When we drift too far off course, they call us back to the center. When the ego refuses to listen, the dream shouts in powerful, vivid, archetypal images. That's the therapeutic power of dreams. They act as natural regulators of the psyche, and when we listen carefully, they can heal trauma, reveal purpose, guide decisions, and awaken sleeping parts of the soul. It's no coincidence that throughout history, dreams have been treated with reverence. In shamanic traditions, dreams were oracles. In ancient Greece, there were temples where people slept to receive healing visions. In Egypt, dreaming was seen as communication with the gods. In all these traditions, there was an ancient wisdom. Dreams are sacred because they connect us to the unseen. Jung recovered that wisdom, but grounded it in psychology. He didn't reduce dreams to fantasy, nor did he see them as supernatural revelations. For him, dreams were natural and deeply human, part of the soul's movement toward wholeness, and that's what makes them sacred. He also developed specific methods to work with dream symbols. One was active imagination, a conscious dialogue with dream figures, allowing them to express themselves without censorship. Another was free association of images, linking dream symbols to personal experiences and universal myths. In both cases, the goal was the same: to help the ego listen to the soul. And this has huge existential value. We live in a culture that worships logic, productivity, and objectivity, and forgets that we're also made of mystery, symbols, and the invisible. Dreams remind us of that every night. They whisper, "You are not only what you think, you are also what you feel." what you imagine, what you've forgotten, and what you still need to remember. When we begin to listen to our dreams, something changes. Life gains depth. We start to see meaning in details, to recognize symbolic patterns in events, to sense a deeper story guiding our path. And that story is written by the self, in partnership with the unconscious. Dreams stop being strange things from the night and become living messages from the soul, allies on the path of self-knowledge. The symbols they bring start guiding us like inner lights. This is Jung's invitation to re-enchant inner listening, to recognize that the unconscious isn't an enemy or a mental garbage bin, but a living, intelligent, symbolic universe that wants to help us become whole. Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." Dreams are the most direct invitation to that inner gaze. They tell us, night after night, that there's more to see, feel, and live. Something that can't be captured by logic, but that reveals itself in symbols, images, and the gestures of the unconscious. In philosophy, the word hermeneutics has always been linked to the act of interpretation. Originally used for reading sacred texts, it comes from the Greek hermeneuin, meaning to translate or to interpret, and is associated with Hermes, the messenger between gods and humans. This symbolism fits perfectly with Jung's approach to dreams and symbols, listening to the soul and translating the unconscious into consciousness without reducing it. But Jung's hermeneutics differ from traditional interpretations. He didn't seek one single, literal, definitive meaning. On the contrary, he taught that a symbol is alive precisely because it's ambiguous, multiple, and layered. As he wrote, "A symbol is the best possible expression for something unknown. The more meanings it carries, the richer it is. That richness, beyond logic, demands a new kind of listening, deep, intuitive, symbolic, and existential. A listening that doesn't try to trap the symbol like a butterfly, but welcomes its dance, its movement, its mystery. Interpretation as expansion, not reduction." In modern science, interpretation usually means reducing a phenomenon to what's already known. A dream, for instance, might be explained as a neural discharge or a repressed desire. Jung found that approach limiting. It assumes that the unknown must be tamed and categorized. But when we do that with the symbols of the unconscious, we destroy their vitality. Jung's proposal is the opposite. It starts from the idea that the symbol is larger than consciousness. So, interpretation must be done with reverence and humility. The goal isn't to explain the symbol, but to dialogue with it. This is what Jung called symbolic amplification, amplificatio. Instead of shrinking the symbol into one fixed meaning, we expand its context, connecting it to myths, legends, religious images, art, and personal history. Each new association illuminates another facet, revealing the symbol in layers, like a many-sided mirror. For example, dreaming of a serpent could mean danger, wisdom, healing, rebirth, betrayal, or life energy. It all depends on the dreamer's relationship with the image, the context of the dream, and their stage of life. For Jung, there is no single correct answer, only a symbolic field to explore. And the wider that field, the more transformative the symbol becomes. The symbol as a mirror of the soul. Multiplicity of meaning isn't a weakness, it's the symbol's greatest strength. By containing many meanings, the symbol reflects the complexity of the human soul. Each time we contemplate it, it reveals something new. Each time we return to a dream, it speaks differently. It grows as our consciousness grows. Jung said that a true symbol is like a living organism. It breathes, changes, and responds to time. When an image, a cross, a tree, an animal, a labyrinth, moves something deep within us, it's not just cultural. It's the unconscious trying to speak a truth we can't yet say. That's why Jung warned against over-intellectualizing symbols. When we turn an image into a fixed concept, we lose the psychic energy it carries. Symbolic interpretation, by contrast, preserves the mystery. It expands meaning without exhausting it, illuminates without freezing it. For Jung, interpretation is always temporary. The symbol is dynamic, and its meaning shifts as the psyche evolves. The same dream may say one thing today and another years later, because the self is always moving, and the soul is always unfolding. Dialogue with the unconscious. A symbol isn't a static message to decode. It's a conversation between ego and unconscious. The symbol offers an image. Consciousness responds with attention and reflection. The unconscious replies again, with another dream, another symbol, another emotion. This continuous exchange is what Jung called active imagination. In active imagination, we don't analyze symbols rationally. We talk to them, listen, and feel. It's like a symbolic meditation where the soul takes the lead. The goal isn't to understand the symbol intellectually, but to integrate it emotionally and spiritually. This kind of listening also has an ethical dimension. It teaches us to respect the mystery in others and in ourselves. When we deal with symbols, we learn not to judge too fast or reduce the unknown to the familiar. We develop patience, sensitivity, reverence, and this inner attitude extends to life itself. Symbols as agents of transformation. Jung believed that symbols don't just inform, they transform. When a true symbol is recognized, it reorganizes the psyche. It acts like a catalyst. It reveals what was hidden and points the way forward. That's why symbols are central to individuation. Working with them isn't an intellectual luxury. It's a necessity of the soul. A consciousness that listens to its own symbols becomes deeper, more creative, more whole, and more humble, aware that it doesn't control everything. This symbolic way of listening is, in essence, a spirituality of the psyche. It restores the sacred, not as belief, but as inner experience. When a symbol speaks, the self is manifesting, and when we listen, the soul awakens. So, Jungian hermeneutics isn't just a method of interpretation, it's a way of living, a way of relating to dreams, to images, to the language of the soul. It's a listening that doesn't dominate but dialogues, that doesn't close meaning but opens it, that doesn't fear ambiguity but embraces it as a sign of inner richness. In a world of noise and superficiality, this symbolic listening is an act of quiet resistance, a call to dream with meaning, to look deeper, to live with soul. Because every symbol we honor, every dream we take seriously, is a step toward the self. As Jung wrote, symbols lead us gently from the world of appearances to the world of essence. And perhaps that's the true path of self-knowledge, learning to listen not with the ears, but with the heart of the soul. Among the many revolutionary ideas Carl Gustav Jung left behind, one of the most surprising was his connection with alchemy, that ancient and mysterious art of the Hermetic philosophers, traditionally associated with turning base metals into gold and discovering the mythical philosopher's stone. To the modern mind, this might seem like a mystical detour, but Jung saw in alchemy something far deeper, a symbolic language of the soul, a powerful metaphor for psychological transformation. Here, Jungian psychology reveals its most symbolic, philosophical, and spiritual nature. Jung realized that the alchemists of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance were not simply trying to produce physical gold in their laboratories. They were, unconsciously, describing their own inner process. The images, formulas, and operations of alchemy were symbolic expressions of a psychic drama, the drama of consciousness transforming itself. This insight became central in Jung's later work. He wrote hundreds of pages about alchemy, especially in books like Psychology and Alchemy, Mysterium Conjunctionis, and Ion. In them, Jung showed that alchemical symbols, fire, Mercury, sulfur, the king and queen, the dragon, the philosopher's stone, correspond to archetypal images that still appear today in dreams, myths, art, and spiritual experiences. But how did Jung reach this conclusion? The discovery of alchemy as the language of the psyche. During his clinical work and his study of dreams, Jung began noticing the recurring presence of strange, vivid symbolic images in his patients. Many of these, especially in people going through deep inner transformation, were identical to illustrations and descriptions found in ancient alchemical texts. Intrigued, Jung spent more than a decade studying Latin, Arabic, and German alchemical manuscripts. The more he read, the more he realized that the alchemists, without knowing it, were describing the same process he called individuation, the soul's journey toward the self. In alchemical language, this was known as the opus magnum, the great work. It involved several distinct phases: nigredo, blackening, the dark night of the soul, the confrontation with the shadow, the collapse of certainties, the symbolic death of the ego; albedo, whitening, purification, inner clarity, the recovery of innocence, the rise of consciousness; citrinitas, yellowing, illumination, the integration of inner light, deeper awareness of self and world; rubedo, reddening, the union of opposites, the birth of the self, the realization of wholeness. Thus, the alchemist's furnace, the athanor, was a metaphor for the human being itself. The material to be transmuted, the raw lead of the soul, symbolized the unconscious contents, the complexes, the traumas, the inner divisions that needed to be transformed. Alchemy as a living myth of transformation. Jung saw alchemy as a living myth of psychic transformation, not fiction, but a symbolic story expressing deep psychological truths through imagery, ritual, and metaphor. This idea carries a powerful existential meaning. It tells us that the human soul is always in the process of transformation. Consciously or not, we are all engaged in our own great work, trying to integrate our fragmented parts, to overcome our shadows, to become what we truly are. Alchemy, in this sense, provides a symbolic map of individuation. Each operation of alchemy mirrors a phase of psychological development. Putrefaction corresponds to the breakdown of old identities, a necessary collapse before rebirth. Coagulation represents the reintegration of scattered parts of the soul. Conjunction, conjunctio, one of alchemy's core ideas, symbolizes the union of opposites, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, into a higher whole. Jung wrote, "Alchemy is the bridge between spirit and matter, between psyche and substance. It is the symbolic dramatization of the soul's becoming." The alchemist as a symbol of the self. The alchemist himself, that mysterious, solitary, and often misunderstood figure, is, for Jung, a symbol of the self. He represents the deepest part of the human being, the one who patiently works within, enduring tension, seeking truth behind appearances. This shows that alchemy was never really about manipulating the external world, but about transforming the inner world. The true gold isn't metal, it's awakened consciousness, the integrated soul, the realized self. This is a radical idea in the modern era, which prizes quick answers, instant results, and external fixes. Jung suggested the opposite. The gold is within. True transformation is silent, symbolic, and psychological, and it demands courage, patience, and surrender. Alchemy, dreams, and active imagination. Another fascinating point is how alchemical symbols continue to appear today, especially in dreams. Jung and his patients often dreamed of alchemical scenes: kings and queens, dragons, sealed vessels, vas hermeticum. This showed him that alchemy wasn't just an old superstition. It was a mirror of the soul. In therapy, Jung used alchemy to help patients grasp the deeper meaning of their dreams. He saw these symbols not as outdated metaphors, but as spontaneous expressions of the collective unconscious. Recognizing them helped people understand that their struggles, conflicts, and suffering were part of a larger, universal process. One of Jung's most powerful tools, active imagination, is closely related to alchemy. By dialoguing with inner images, drawing them, meditating on them, the individual recreates the alchemical process within the psyche. The unconscious works, the self acts, the ego learns to stay quiet, and transformation unfolds. Alchemy, the psychology of the soul in motion. Jung saw alchemy as a symbolic system older than psychology, and in some ways, deeper than it. Modern psychology often tries to make people adapt to the world. Alchemy calls for inner transformation, a journey that demands sacrifice, patience, and confrontation. It doesn't promise comfort, but meaning. And that meaning isn't about constant happiness. It's about becoming whole, integrating light and shadow, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter. It's about realizing the self, finding within the soul the philosopher's stone, the symbol of inner totality. Alchemy teaches that there are no shortcuts to transformation. Every true change requires passing through chaos, enduring fire, dissolving what's false, and reuniting what was split apart. It's both an art and an ethic. For Jung, it's the great living myth of the psyche. Reinterpreted through Jung's lens, alchemy is not an obsolete science, but an eternal language of the soul. A symbolic language that still echoes in dreams, visions, and moments of deep self-awareness. It shows that every human being is, in essence, an unconscious alchemist, seeking their own inner transmutation. When we learn to read this symbolic language, to see the gold hidden within the lead of our struggles, we begin to understand that our suffering has meaning, that our conflicts serve a purpose, and that the soul has a path, even in the dark. As Jung wrote, the gold we seek is the being we become, once we are whole, the raw material of the soul. Chaos as the beginning. In classical alchemy, everything begins with prima materia, the raw, impure, chaotic substance that must undergo complex processes of separation, purification, and recombination. Jung saw this as a direct metaphor for the human psyche in its natural state. When we begin the journey of self-knowledge, we carry within us disorganized material, repressed emotions, contradictions, old wounds, fragments of the shadow. This is the raw material of the soul. The first stage is often the hardest. The nigredo, the blackening, the dark confusion that breaks down the old ego structure. Jung recognized that real transformation always requires a period of symbolic chaos, when the ego is forced to face what it once denied or feared. But this chaos isn't destructive, it's fertile. It's the living material from which new form will emerge. As Heraclitus said, the path up and the path down are one and the same. Jung would agree, only what breaks can truly transform. The fire of consciousness, the symbolic heat of transformation. Fire is one of alchemy's key elements, the heat that drives transmutation. Without fire, there is no alchemy. But this fire is symbolic. It represents consciousness. For Jung, the fire is the act of awareness, the courage to look honestly at what rises from the unconscious. It's this inner fire that slowly cooks the raw material, melting illusions, dissolving old masks, and turning chaos into meaning. This process is painful, but necessary. It's not about eliminating darkness, but illuminating it. The alchemists called this phase patientia, spiritual patience. You can't rush the soul's transmutation. Just as real gold takes time to form, the self only emerges after the ego has endured enough tension between its opposites. Dissolve and recombine. The dialectic of transformation. Another core alchemical principle is solve et coagula, dissolve and reconstitute. Jung saw this as the essence of psychological transformation. The psyche must first be dissolved into its basic elements, beliefs, complexes, memories, identities, before it can be rebuilt in a more authentic way. This is a dialectical process. We must separate to later unite, differentiate to later integrate. Individuation, for Jung, isn't fusion but reconciliation. Masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, instinct and spirit. These polarities aren't meant to be erased, but held in creative tension. The goal is not purity, but integrated complexity. Alchemical gold is not simple, it's dense, symbolic, full of contradictions. That's what makes it real. As Nietzsche said, another influence on Jung, one must have chaos within to give birth to a dancing star. The conjunction, the union of opposites, the birth of the self. The culmination of alchemy is the conjunctio, the sacred union of opposites, symbolized by the marriage of the king and queen, the sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. This moment represents the birth of the self, the organizing center of the psyche, the archetype of totality. This union isn't literal or external, it's an inner integration. The self is a new identity, deeper than the ego, wider than the persona. It's the soul becoming whole, not because it's perfect, but because it's complete. Jung described the realization of the self as a kind of inner rebirth. Something dies, the old identity, the false image, and something new is born, a more truthful, centered, and alive being. This is the goal of inner alchemy, to produce philosophical gold, the fully realized human being. Alchemy and time. The slow art of becoming alchemy is, by nature, an art of time. It rejects instant fixes and easy answers. Jung saw deep wisdom in that. Becoming isn't an event, it's a process, and it demands patience, introspection, and humility. In a world obsessed with speed, anxiety, and performance, alchemy invites us to slow down. It reminds us that the soul needs silence, that transformation isn't measured by quick results, but by symbolic depth. Inner gold is not produced through external formulas, but through internal confrontation. This philosophy is profoundly countercultural. It values the invisible, the ambiguous, the symbolic. It teaches that real fulfillment doesn't come from reaching an ideal, but from becoming who we truly are. The philosophical gold, the self as the final work. At the end of their work, the alchemists sought the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, symbol of perfection, healing, and immortality. For Jung, that stone symbolized the self, the whole reconciled soul, at peace with its shadow and its opposites. The self isn't something to be conquered, but a state of being that appears when the ego finally learns to listen. The philosophical gold is exactly that, a consciousness at peace with itself, a person reconciled with their history, their pain, their darkness, and their destiny. There is no greater gold than this, no deeper alchemy than the one that transforms us into who we truly are, with courage, honesty, and soul. Reinterpreted by Jung, alchemy offers more than a therapeutic model. It offers a philosophy of existence, a symbolic, profound, and spiritual vision of human life as an unfinished work of art, imperfect, evolving, but full of meaning. In this vision, suffering isn't punishment, it's the fire of transformation. Chaos isn't the end, it's the beginning. The unconscious isn't the enemy, it's the laboratory of the soul. As Jung wrote, alchemy is the mirror in which the human soul saw itself, in the process of transformation. And when we dare to look into that mirror with courage and attention, we too can see ourselves, not just as we are now, but as what we are meant to become. Within the deep architecture of the human psyche, described by Carl Gustav Jung, few concepts are as symbolic, revealing, and transformative as the archetypes of the Anima and the Animus. These two inner figures are far more than representations of feminine and masculine. They are archetypal structures that operate within every human soul, living forces that connect consciousness to the unconscious, the ego to the totality, the self to the other. According to Jung, the anima is the archetype of the feminine in a man's psyche, while the animus is the archetype of the masculine in a woman's psyche. Both are images of the inner other, the unconscious and complementary aspect of our biological sex. And they deeply influence our emotions, judgments, fantasies, relationships, and the entire process of individuation. These archetypes don't appear by accident. They emerge from collective patterns, universal symbolic images that live within the collective unconscious of humanity. The anima and animus are inherited psychic structures that rise from our depths, often without our awareness, guiding or confusing us, confronting us with our limits, and pointing us toward transformation. The anima, the inner feminine in men. For Jung, the anima represents the personification of the feminine within a man's unconscious. This doesn't mean feminine traits in the cultural or behavioral sense, but rather an inner principle of emotionality, intuition, imagination, receptivity, sensitivity, and connection with the symbolic world. The anima appears in dreams, romantic projections, artistic creation, the search for beauty, or a feeling of soulful nostalgia. At the lower levels of consciousness, she can manifest as seductive, dangerous, idealized, or childlike figures, signs of an immature relationship with the inner feminine. As a man matures and integrates his anima, she evolves into something deeper, the symbolic mediator between the ego and the self, the spiritual guide, the inspiring soul, the bridge to the deeper unconscious. For Jung, recognizing and dialoguing with the anima is an essential part of a man's individuation process. Until he does, he remains prone to project his inner feminine onto external women, idealizing, devaluing, or confusing his relationships. Only when he realizes that the woman he seeks outside is first of all a reflection of his own soul, can he begin to become whole. The anima evolves through stages, from erotic to maternal, from wise to spiritual. And in each stage, she challenges the man to move beyond excessive rationalism and reconnect with the mystery of the soul. The animus, the inner masculine in women. On the other side, the animus represents the masculine archetype within a woman's psyche. Like the anima in men, the animus is an unconscious force that connects a woman to her rational, active, and decisive side. Her capacity for thought, conviction, and inner strength. When unintegrated, the animus can appear rigid, authoritarian, or dogmatic. It often manifests through inner voices that dominate a woman's mind with absolute statements. You must. You can't. This is useless. Jung observed that many women possessed by an unconscious animus became trapped by ideas that weren't truly theirs, losing touch with their deeper feelings and intuitions. However, when integrated, the animus becomes a creative, protective, and constructive force. He represents the inner logos, the ability to organize thoughts, act with purpose, and stay grounded. He also guides the woman toward the self, helping her move beyond social roles and external expectations. Like the anima, the animus evolves through stages, from raw power to intellectual authority, from teacher to spiritual guardian. In each phase, he challenges the woman to find her authentic inner voice, freeing herself from projections onto men in the outer world, the bridge between conscious and unconscious. More than simply internal masculine or feminine energies, Jung saw anima and animus as bridges between consciousness and the unconscious, channels through which the ego communicates with the deeper psyche. Without this bridge, the ego becomes isolated, losing contact with symbols, dreams, and the inner mystery. With it, the soul begins to speak, and individuation gains momentum. In this sense, the anima and animus act as psychopomps, mythological guides of the soul who lead us between worlds. They are Hermes and Persephone, Orpheus and Hecate, figures who accompany the hero or heroine on their descent into the unconscious during times of crisis, transition, and rebirth. Jung emphasized that these figures are not inventions. They emerge naturally in dreams, fantasies, art, and even psychological disturbances. They have always lived within the human psyche, helping us face transformation and integrate the unseen. Projection and relationships. One of the most striking aspects of the anima and animus archetypes is their tendency to project themselves onto others, especially in romantic relationships. Often, what we see or seek in another person is not simply who they are, but a symbolic image that lives within us. A man may project his anima onto a woman, seeing in her the beauty, depth, or salvation he unconsciously seeks in himself. A woman may project her animus onto a man, expecting him to embody strength, wisdom, or direction. These projections create powerful, idealized, and sometimes chaotic relationships. The issue is not love itself, but unconscious love. When we fail to recognize our projections, we become lost in them. But when we become aware of them, we can reclaim those images, withdraw the archetype, and integrate it into our soul. Relationships then shift from fantasy to genuine encounter. In this way, Anima and Animus teach us that the other is a mirror, and that what we see reflected is often part of ourselves. Individuation and the integration of the inner other. Integrating the anima or animus is not easy, but it is essential for psychological maturity. Jung saw this process as a key stage of individuation, the path toward wholeness. As long as these inner figures remain unconscious, we stay fragmented, dependent on projections, and lacking a true center. Integration begins with recognition, realizing that the image that attracts, fascinates, or disturbs us isn't out there, but in here. Then comes dialogue, dreaming of the anima, speaking with the animus, allowing them to appear not as fantasies, but as living energies of the soul. Finally, we act from a more integrated self, no longer needing others to complete us, but understanding that wholeness begins within. The anima and animus are far more than gender symbols. They are symbols of the soul's search for wholeness. They remind us that within every man lives a symbolic woman, and within every woman, an inner man. True psychological growth happens not by denying these polarities, but by embracing and integrating them. Jung gave us the key to this process, a reminder that becoming whole is above all an act of reconciliation with the other who lives within us. As he wrote, the psyche is androgynous, and the soul, in its essence, seeks to unite what life has separated. The dialectic of opposites, the soul's inner dance. Jung's psychology shows that the human being is a field of opposing forces. Within each of us live contradictions, light and shadow, reason and emotion, instinct and spirit, masculine and feminine. Instead of viewing these opposites as flaws to be fixed, Jung saw them as the engine of transformation. Consciousness arises from the tension between opposites, and individuation is the process of integrating them into wholeness. At the heart of this dialectic lies the encounter with the anima and animus. Jung boldly proposed that every human being carries both masculine, logos, and feminine, eros, principles, regardless of biological sex. Psychological maturity depends on reconciling these inner energies, a dance reminiscent of the ancient wisdom of yin and yang. The dialectic as the psyche's core movement. For Jung, the psyche is dialectical by nature. It operates through opposition and synthesis, tension and resolution. Consciousness evolves not by denying one side, but by engaging both. This idea echoes classical philosophy, from Heraclitus, who said, "Conflict is the father of all things," to Hegel, who saw history unfolding through thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But Jung brought this dialectic into psychic experience. Each of us is a stage where opposing forces act out their drama, none more universal than the inner masculine and feminine as archetypal principles. For Jung, masculine and feminine are not simply biological or social categories. They are archetypal principles, symbolic ways of being and relating to the world. The masculine principle, represented by the animus in women, is linked to structure, clarity, reason, strength, and purpose. The feminine principle, represented by the anima in men, is connected to intuition, empathy, emotional connection, imagination, and flow. Both live within every human soul. When one dominates the other, In individuals or entire cultures, fragmentation occurs. A man ruled only by his masculine side becomes rigid, over-rational, emotionally blind. A woman ruled only by her feminine side may become passive, detached from her own power to act. But when these forces meet and balance, something new emerges. A third reality, a living synthesis. Wholeness, yin and yang, the wisdom of complementarity. Jung's view mirrors the Taoist symbol of yin-yang. The white, yang, masculine, holds a black point, yin, feminine, and the black holds a white point. They are never separate. One always contains the seed of the other. They are not enemies, but partners in harmony. Jung admired this Eastern wisdom for its non-dual understanding of life. Western thinking tends to divide. Reason versus emotion, logic versus intuition, while Eastern philosophy sees opposites as dynamic, cyclical, and complementary. That's what Jung brought into modern psychology, an invitation to stop identifying with one side and to recognize that being whole means embracing our multiplicity, not being one, but being many, reconciled within. Individuation as reconciliation of opposites. In individuation, reconciling the inner masculine and feminine is one of the psyche's great tasks. Integration doesn't erase differences. It turns polarity into complementarity. For a man, it means embracing his anima, allowing himself to feel, imagine, and intuit. For a woman, it means integrating her animus, asserting her voice, thinking clearly, acting with purpose. When a man integrates his anima, he becomes more empathetic, creative, and emotionally attuned. When a woman integrates her animus, she becomes more centered, discerning, and expressive of her inner wisdom. Both become more human and less bound by cultural roles. This union is not a static state, but a living process. The ego expands, the self unfolds, and the psyche discovers new ways to express itself. The shadow of one-sidedness. When we reject one pole, the inner masculine or feminine, it doesn't vanish. It sinks into the shadow, the part of the psyche that holds what the ego denies. A man who rejects his sensitivity may project weakness or manipulation onto women. A woman who represses her assertiveness may see men as domineering or saviors. These judgments often reveal the unintegrated opposite within. That's why Jung's dialectic isn't just psychological, it's ethical. Reconciling the inner masculine and feminine is an act of maturity, courage, and responsibility toward the soul. It means choosing to see oneself fully, not halfway. The sacred androgyne, a symbol of wholeness. Many myths and spiritual traditions express this inner reconciliation through the sacred androgynous being, one who embodies both masculine and feminine qualities in unity. Jung found this symbol across traditions, from the rebus of alchemy to Gnostic and Eastern imagery. This figure doesn't represent a literal blending of genders, but a soul that has integrated its opposites. It symbolizes the self, the being that has transcended division and lives in harmony with its many dimensions. By recovering this image, Jung reminds us of a timeless truth. The soul is not binary. It's plural, cyclical, and whole. To mature spiritually is to inhabit these polarities without being ruled by them, to let the masculine and feminine dance, not divide. The dialectic of opposites is, therefore, a call to inner reconciliation, for man to recognize his soul, for woman to discover her spirit, to stop seeking outside what already exists within, to let consciousness expand and the human being become whole. Integrating the masculine and feminine is an act of self-love, a journey of healing, discovery, and depth. It means no longer fighting against yourself, but finally listening to the many voices of your soul. As Jung wrote, wholeness is made of opposites. Light needs darkness. The masculine needs the feminine. And a human being is fulfilled only when they recognize all their halves within themselves. In the modern world, talking about religion and spirituality often puts us in front of a divide. On one side, the skepticism of science, which demands facts and proof. On the other, dogmatic faith, which demands obedience and belief. But Carl Gustav Jung, with his deep understanding of the psyche, offered a third path, neither strictly rational nor traditionally religious, but symbolic. For him, religion was, above all, a language of the soul. Jung saw religion as a psychological necessity, a symbolic expression of inner truths that go beyond logic or scientific explanation. He didn't judge faith by its literal meaning, but by what it represented in the inner world. More than defending or criticizing dogmas, Jung wanted to understand the role that religious images, myths, and rituals play in the psychological and spiritual life of human beings. The unconscious and the symbol of the sacred. In analytical psychology, the unconscious is not just a storage place for repressed impulses. It's a creative and dynamic source of symbolic images, many of which have a religious or spiritual nature. Dreams involving temples, crosses, snakes, lights, voices, gods, or archetypal figures often appear even in people who have never considered themselves religious. For Jung, this showed that the sacred is a universal psychic phenomenon, something that rises naturally from the structure of the human soul itself. These images express what he called the numinous, a term borrowed from theologian Rudolf Otto, who described the sacred as something that evokes both fascination and fear, something completely other. Jung said that the numinous experience isn't created by the mind. It happens to us as a sudden eruption of meaning from the unconscious. It's that moment when we feel that something greater than ourselves is calling, transforming, unsettling us. Religion, in Jung's view, is the collection of symbols cultures have developed to deal with this experience of the numinous. It organizes, expresses, and gives form to mystery. But the mystery itself always remains. The psychological value of religion, Jung stated clearly, religion is one of the oldest and most universal expressions of the human soul. To deny it completely, as some rationalist schools have done, is to cut off an essential part of the psyche. In his Patience, Jung saw the effects of losing touch with the sacred, existential emptiness, loss of meaning, spiritual depression, what he called the neurosis of modernity. For him, this loss of connection to the sacred is one of the great illnesses of the modern soul. The return to spirituality shouldn't be a retreat to dogma, but a symbolic rediscovery of the mystery of existence, a way to see religious imagery not as absolute truth, but as living metaphors for the soul's journey. Thus, religion doesn't need to be rejected by those seeking spiritual independence. It can be reinterpreted and integrated as part of the process of individuation. The soul thirsts for meaning, and religious myths offer an ancient language for that search. A critique of dogmatism. Despite recognizing religion's psychological importance, Jung was highly critical of religious dogmatism. He was concerned by the tendency of some traditions to impose absolute truths, suppress symbolic thought, and deny personal experience. For him, authentic faith is born from inner experience, not blind obedience. When religion becomes an institution that demands submission instead of transformation, it loses its real purpose, the evolution of the soul. Jung was particularly critical of aspects of Western Christian theology that, in his view, repressed the instinctive and shadow side of human nature, promoting a puritanical spirituality disconnected from psychic reality. He saw this as dangerous, separating the sacred from the body, from the feminine, from the unconscious. Instead, Jung proposed a spirituality that embraced the whole psyche, including its darkness. Evil, doubt, suffering, and ambiguity are all part of the human condition and must be recognized and symbolized, not denied. Jesus Christ as an archetype. Jung also reinterpreted religious figures symbolically. For example, he saw Jesus Christ as an archetypal image of the self, a symbol of psychic wholeness, of the union of opposites, of the necessary sacrifice that leads to transformation. The crucifixion represents the suffering inherent in individuation, and the resurrection symbolizes the rebirth of consciousness after integrating the shadow. This reading doesn't diminish religion, it expands it. Seeing Christ not only as a historical figure, but but as a symbolic image of the soul in transformation. Jung renewed the relevance of spirituality for modern individuals. Similarly, he saw figures like Buddha, Krishna, Mary, and Egyptian deities as archetypal expressions that emerge in different cultures to give form to the same inner drama, the soul's journey toward wholeness. Religion versus religiosity. A key distinction in Jung's view is between organized religion and inner religiosity. The first deals with doctrines, institutions, and rules. The second is an attitude of the soul, an openness to mystery, to the sacred, to what is unseen. Jung respected religions, but valued authentic spiritual experience even more. He believed that every human being has a natural tendency toward religiosity, not necessarily to belong to a church, but to seek meaning, transcendence, and connection with something greater. He called this drive the transcendent function of the psyche. This inner religiosity can be lived inside or outside a tradition. It can appear in art, meditation, nature, dreams, or contemplation. What matters for Jung is not the form, but the living experience of the sacred. Dreams as religious experiences. One of Jung's most fascinating ideas is that dreams are miniature religious experiences. When we dream of archetypal symbols, crosses, temples, light, sacred animals, we are, in Jung's words, coming into contact with the divine within us. These dreams shouldn't be read literally or morally. They are symbolic messages from the unconscious, trying to reconnect us with the soul's center. Often they express deep desires for reconciliation, forgiveness, or renewal, spiritual themes lived subjectively. In this way, dream analysis becomes almost a modern sacred ritual, a way of listening to the divine, not in external words, but through inner images. The self as a symbol of the inner divine. At the core of Jung's spirituality lies the self, the archetype of wholeness, the regulating center of the psyche, the God within. For Jung, the religious quest is ultimately the search for the self. This doesn't mean that God is an invention of the psyche, but that the experience of the divine is lived through it. The soul is the space where the sacred reveals itself. To know oneself, therefore, is also, in some sense, to know the divine. This is what Jung called a symbolic spirituality, not projecting God only into the heavens, but recognizing him in the depths of the human heart. The self, as the inner image of God, guides us toward meaning, integration, and union with the whole. Jung's approach doesn't invite blind belief or cynical denial. It calls us to a third way, the symbolic path of the soul, where the sacred is seen not as something distant, but as a living language emerging from within. The numinous. When mystery touches us, at the center of Jung's philosophy of the sacred is the concept of the numinous, again borrowed from Rudolf Otto. The numinous is that which profoundly affects us, even when we can't fully understand it. Otto described it as mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a mystery that both fascinates and terrifies. Jung used this term to describe moments of deep experience, a powerful dream, an overwhelming emotion, an image that shakes us, or an existential crisis that reveals something beyond reason. In those moments, the ego realizes it's not in control. Something larger speaks through the unconscious, and we must listen. This encounter can happen anywhere, in a church, a forest, or even in the middle of despair. What matters is not where it happens, but what it awakens within us, a direct sense of the sacred, of life's unexplainable depth. Symbols, the language of the invisible. If the numinous is the raw experience of the sacred, the symbol is its expression. For Jung, symbols are the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, between the visible and the invisible. Religious symbols, the cross, the serpent, the chalice, the mountain, hold deep collective meanings, but symbols also rise spontaneously in dreams, fantasies, and art. They are not fixed signs with one meaning. They are alive, carrying layers of significance that speak to the imagination. Unlike modern science, which seeks clarity and definition, the symbol preserves mystery. It doesn't explain, it reveals. Without symbols, the soul falls silent. That's why Jung said that losing religious symbols has left modern humans spiritually orphaned. Without a language for mystery, all that remains is emptiness, nihilism, and anxiety. Reconnecting with the symbolic is, therefore, a profound act of healing. Myth, the story of meaning. Jung saw myths as the great symbolic narratives of humanity. Far from being old superstitions, they are structured expressions of the universal human experience. Myths tell of the hero's journey, the battle with the shadow, the quest for wholeness, death, and rebirth. Myths are not false, they are true in another way. They speak to the soul, not the intellect. That's why they survive across ages and cultures, reappearing in films, literature, psychology, and dreams. For Jung, myths give shape to chaos. When we're lost, a myth can guide us. When we're in crisis, a myth can help us make sense of our suffering. As he said, those who don't know the myths live their own lives as if they were the first to suffer, the first to love, the first to die. Rationality and mystery. The limits of knowledge. A crucial point in Jung's philosophy of the sacred is recognizing the limits of reason. Rationality is a great achievement of consciousness, but it's not the only way of knowing. The soul also knows through feeling, intuition, and imagination, and the sacred lives exactly in these dimensions. For Jung, the problem with modernity is that reason has become tyrannical. Anything that can't be measured or proven is dismissed. As a result, we lose touch with mystery, and with it, our connection to the soul. Jung's critique wasn't anti-science, it was a call for balance. Science explains how the world works. Spirituality asks why we exist. Both are essential, and when they meet, a deeper vision of humanity emerges. One that is integral, symbolic, and sacred. The sacred as a living experience. For Jung, the sacred is not an idea. It's a living experience. It can be felt in nature, silence, suffering, birth, death, or a powerful dream. It doesn't matter whether someone calls themselves religious or not. What matters is how deeply they are moved by the experience and how it transforms them. The sacred for Jung is an invisible presence acting in the soul. It's not limited to churches or doctrines. It can appear anywhere, as long as we're willing to listen inwardly. The sacred is what touches the deepest part of us and pushes us toward change. That's why the sacred is inseparable from individuation, the process of becoming whole. There is no true maturity without contact with mystery. The self, the center of the psyche, is itself a symbol of the inner divine. To find it is, in some sense, to find God, not outside, but within. Jung's philosophy of the sacred is, in the end, a philosophy of the soul. It tells us that human beings are more than matter and more than mind. We are symbolic, spiritual beings, open to the mystery. And the mystery is not a problem to be solved. It's the essence of existence itself. In a world obsessed with control and certainty, Jung invites us to make room for the unknown, to honor the numinous, to listen to symbols, and to live the myths. He reminds us that the soul doesn't feed on certainty, it feeds on meaning, and meaning is born when we look at the invisible with symbolic eyes. As Jung wrote, "The only way to understand the sacred is to live it. Where reason ends, mystery begins, and that is where the soul resides." Few thinkers of the 20th century have had as deep, lasting, and wide-reaching an influence as Carl Gustav Jung. His psychology, born from a painful split with Freud, went far beyond the walls of clinical practice and reached fields as diverse as art, literature, religion, mythology, philosophy, and even computer science. Jung was not just a psychiatrist, he was an explorer of the human soul in all its dimensions. During his lifetime, some saw him as a mystic, others as an heir to the Enlightenment. After his death, his legacy only grew. Today, he is recognized as one of the great interpreters of the modern human condition. especially for his ability to integrate opposites, reason and myth, science and spirituality, the individual and the collective, East and West. His work, far from being limited to clinical psychology, became a bridge between different forms of knowledge. And it's in this interdisciplinarity that the transformative power of his contribution lies. Psychology, a new language for the soul. In psychology, Jung's impact is undeniable. His model of the psyche, structured into the ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious, and his core concepts like archetypes, the self, the shadow, the anima, animus, and individuation radically changed how we understand what it means to be human. Analytical psychology, founded by Jung, inspired new forms of psychotherapy that go beyond symptom correction. It proposes a path of self-knowledge and psychic integration. Jung saw therapy not as behavior adjustment, but as a symbolic journey, where every pain carries a hidden meaning waiting to be discovered. Even psychologists outside the Jungian school have embraced his ideas about the importance of dreams, symbols, and a culturally rooted, subjective approach to the mind. Jung also anticipated, decades before they emerged, what we now call transpersonal psychology and depth psychology, movements that restored the spiritual and mystical as legitimate aspects of the psyche. Art and active imagination, the unconscious as creator. Jung's relationship with art was intimate and almost inevitable. He himself drew, painted, and sculpted as ways to express his inner world. His method of active imagination, a dialogue with inner images, fantasies, and symbols, remains one of the most powerful psychological tools for creativity. Artists across movements, from expressionism to surrealism, from film to contemporary art, were deeply influenced by him. Figures like Joseph Campbell, James Hillman, Anselm Kiefer, David Lynch, and even George Lucas drew from Jungian ideas to craft works that explore myth, archetypes, and the symbolic structures of the soul. The notion that the artist serves as a medium for the collective unconscious, channeling universal images, resonates strongly in modern culture. Jung helped free art from pure aesthetics, framing it as an alchemical act of revelation, a bridge between the conscious and unconscious. Today, his influence lives on in art therapy, psychodrama, symbolic cinema, and in the growing understanding of imagination as a transformative force. Literature and the archetypal narrative. Literature has always been fertile ground for archetypes, but it was Jung who showed writers and readers how stories express the soul's collective patterns. He directly inspired Joseph Campbell, whose book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, became one of the most influential works in literary theory and pop culture. Campbell, based on Jung's ideas, described the monomyth, the hero's journey, that appears in ancient epics and modern stories like Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, and The Matrix. Writers such as Hermann Hesse, Demian, Steppenwolf were personally and intellectually influenced by Jung, incorporating his psychology into characters searching for meaning and self-realization. Post-Jungian literary criticism also flourished. Thinkers like James Hillman and Marie-Louise von Franz developed methods to interpret fairy tales, myths, and novels as reflections of the collective unconscious. Literature, under Jung's light, became a mirror for the fragmented, conflicted, yet ever-evolving human soul. Comparative religion and mythology. A dialogue with the eternal Jung's work deeply shaped the study of comparative religion and mythology. His symbolic interpretation of religious traditions allowed theologians, philosophers, and anthropologists to revisit ancient texts, not as literal truths, but as archetypal narratives of the soul's journey. Thanks to Jung, it became possible to read the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, Gnostic writings, or Celtic legends as metaphors for universal psychic experiences. This perspective influenced scholars like Mircea Eliade, Northrop Frye, Karen Armstrong, and Joseph Campbell, and opened the door for a more symbolic, less dogmatic dialogue between religions. His idea that God is a living psychic image shocked traditional theologians but liberated many from literalism. For Jung, the sacred was real. and it manifested through the symbols of the soul. Religion, then, became not a system of beliefs, but a symbolic language of wholeness, science, technology, and artificial intelligence. Surprisingly, Jung's influence reached even into fields he never lived to see fully develop, like computer science and artificial intelligence, AI. His concept of the collective unconscious, with its universal patterns of perception and behavior, inspired researchers who tried to model symbolic human cognition in machines. Neural networks and symbolic reasoning systems, in a sense, reflect Jung's insight that patterns and archetypes structure how we process reality. Moreover, his view of archetypes as universal structures influenced areas like cognitive science, game design, narrative simulation, and AI-based personality modeling. Even though Jung didn't work directly with technology, his vision of the psyche as a complex system of patterns resonates with modern theories of complexity, emergence, and even quantum physics. Popular culture and modern spirituality today, Jung's name appears everywhere, in self-help, spirituality, meditation, astrology, and holistic therapy. Although not always applied with depth, his ideas have become part of the modern language of self-discovery. Concepts like the shadow, archetypes, and individuation are now used to explain personal crises, identity struggles, and spiritual growth. Jung has become, for many, a symbolic guide for the modern soul, someone who helps people navigate between chaos and meaning. His legacy reaches beyond academia. It speaks to seekers, artists, therapists, and spiritual wanderers. His thought, both profound and accessible, meets a collective need. To reunite the fragmented, give meaning to chaos, and reconnect humanity with mystery. Accusations of mysticism, the limits of science. Throughout the 20th century, Jung faced recurring criticism, especially the claim that he crossed into esoteric or unscientific territory. His fascination with alchemy, astrology, and Eastern spirituality was seen by many academics as proof that he had strayed from empirical science. Critics argued that his study of alchemy, interpreting it as a metaphor for the soul's transformation, was more fantasy than psychology. His ideas about synchronicity, meaningful coincidences without causal explanation, also drew skepticism for lacking scientific proof. For mainstream psychology, rooted in positivism and behaviorism, Jung's approach seemed too symbolic, subjective, and metaphysical. Jung's response: a science of the soul. Jung never claimed to be doing natural science. He was clear that his field was the psyche, not physical matter. He believed that the human soul required a different method, one that was symbolic, interpretative, and experiential. As he once said, "The psychologist works with images. What they mean is more important than whether they are real or imagined." For Jung, the psyche speaks through symbols, and symbols cannot be measured. They must be understood. To reduce psychology to what can be quantified, he argued, is to betray its essence. His work was not meant to prove scientific facts, but to reveal psychic meaning. In that sense, Jung's psychology is closer to philosophy, theology, and art than to biology or physics. Beyond instrumental reason, a critique of modernity. At a deeper level, Jung's critics reflect a philosophical clash between two kinds of reason. On one side, instrumental reason, the modern scientific mindset, focused on control, measurement, and efficiency. On the other, symbolic reason, which values mystery, contradiction, and meaning as essential to human experience. Jung stood firmly with the latter. His work is, in many ways, a rebellion against the soulless rationalism of modernity. He sought to recover what had been forgotten: myth, ritual, the sacred, intuition, and the unconscious. In this sense, Jung's thought echoes Nietzsche's critique of rationalization, Kierkegaard's call for subjectivity, and Heidegger's concern for the forgotten depth of being. Analytical psychology is thus not only a therapeutic system, but a philosophical response to the spiritual emptiness of the modern age. The symbolic depth, as method supporters of Jung argue that critics miss the point. His method is symbolic by nature, not pseudoscientific. Jung was not seeking measurable data, but psychological meaning. For him, the symbol is not a metaphor. It is a living psychic reality, emerging from the collective unconscious and giving structure to human experience. Working with symbols doesn't mean abandoning science. It means acknowledging that the soul doesn't speak in logic. It speaks in images, myths, and dream. This symbolic approach places Jung closer to phenomenology, hermeneutics, and existential analysis than to experimental psychology. Thinkers like Paul Ricoeur and Hans-Georg Gadamer later echoed similar ideas. That meaning is born through interpretation, not measurement. Despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy, Jung's influence remains immense. His thought resurfaces at the crossroads of psychology, spirituality, philosophy, and art. His philosophy of the soul continues to inspire those who explore myth, symbolism, and the unconscious culture of humanity. His followers, Marie-Louise von Franz, Aniela Jaffé, Esther Harding, James Hillman, expanded his ideas with intellectual rigor and creative depth. Theologians and philosophers like Paul Tillich and David Tacey also drew on Jung's idea of the self as the image of God within, finding in it a bridge between psychology and spirituality. Jung's legacy is not comfortable. He doesn't fit into rigid categories. He's not only a psychologist, nor only a philosopher or mystic. He is all of these and more. His work challenges the technical mindset of modern thought and invites us to listen again to what was silenced: the symbol, the myth, the invisible. The accusations of mysticism say more about the limits of modern rationality than about the value of Jung's ideas. He didn't reject reason, he expanded it. He showed that there are other ways of knowing, that truth is not only factual but also symbolic, and that the soul cannot be reduced to measurable behavior. It lives in stories, images, and mysteries. As Jung himself said, "What we do not face within ourselves, we will encounter as fate." And perhaps that is the heart of his philosophy, an invitation for humanity to face its own depth, even if that means venturing into what is uncertain, mysterious, symbolic, and profoundly true. And so we come to the end of another journey through the deep and symbolic mind of Carl Gustav Jung. If you've made it this far, it means that, like us, you're searching for something greater: meaning, self-knowledge, transformation. And that alone is already the first step on the path of individuation. We sincerely thank you for being here, for listening with attention, and for taking the time to dive into themes that modern life so often tries to silence. Here on this channel, we honor the complexity of the soul and value every honest question that appears along the way. If this content touched you in any way, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment sharing what stood out to you or what reflections came to mind. Your voice is a living part of this community. Share this video with someone who's also trying to understand the human soul more deeply. The soul will thank you for it. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next episodes. The journey of thought continues here, with Jung, with other great minds in philosophy, and with the questions that keep us moving. Stay with us. There's much more to come. See you in the next video. And remember, looking within is always an act of courage.